Welcome, dear listener, to Sleepy Rain Horror, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. As you drift into the unknown, remember that some whispers are better left unheard. But here, they're impossible to ignore. If you enjoy this tale and haven't fallen asleep yet, or are brave enough to stay awake, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Let's see if you can make it through to the end without a single scream. The rain poured relentlessly against the windows of my old sedan as I drove through the winding roads of a forgotten countryside. The headlights barely cut through the dense fog that clung to the earth like a phantom shroud. It was supposed to be a simple drive, a quiet escape from the suffocating pace of the city. I wanted peace, a moment to breathe. What I found instead would change me forever. The map app had failed miles ago, leaving me dependent on memory and vague signs that pointed to nowhere. The trees seemed to close in tighter as the road narrowed, their skeletal branches clawing at the car as though trying to warn me away. Just as I was about to turn back, my dim headlights illuminated a crooked signpost, nearly swallowed by overgrown weeds. The words Briar Hollow were barely legible beneath layers of peeling paint. Curiosity tugged at me. Briar Hollow wasn't marked on any of the maps I'd studied before the trip. It felt like something forgotten by time. Against my better judgment, I turned down the gravel path the sign pointed to. The car protested as the tires crunched over uneven stones, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The rain fell harder now, drumming on the roof in an almost rhythmic pulse. The first glimpse of the manor sent a shiver down my spine. It stood at the end of the path like a sentinel of another era. Towering and ancient, its silhouette loomed against the stormy sky. The windows, dark and lifeless, seemed like hollow eyes watching my every move. A single light flickered above the front door, casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown lawn. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and drive away, but something about the place held me. It wasn't just the eerie beauty of its decay. It was the sense that the house was waiting for me. As I stepped out of the car, the rain soaked through my jacket in seconds. I hesitated at the wrought iron gate, which groaned in protest as I pushed it open. The air was heavy, oppressive, carrying a faint metallic scent that I couldn't place. With each step toward the house, my heartbeat quickened. The sound of my boots on the cracked stone path seemed deafening against the backdrop of the rain. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly as though beckoning me in. I paused on the threshold, peering into the dim interior. The hallway stretched into darkness, the faint light from outside barely reaching the dusty wooden floors. The air inside was colder, carrying an unmistakable sense of abandonment. Yet, beneath the stillness, there was a strange hum, almost imperceptible, as though the house itself was alive. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing eerily. The door creaked shut behind me with a soft click, and I froze. My breath came in shallow gasps as I strained to listen. The hum was louder now, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from the very walls. Hello. My voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. It felt wrong to speak here, as though I were disturbing something sacred or cursed. No answer came, only the persistent hum and the sound of rain beating against the roof. The first room I entered was a parlor. Dusty furniture was shrouded in yellowed sheets, and an ornate chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling. A cracked mirror on the far wall reflected the dim light, distorting my reflection into something unrecognizable. As I moved deeper into the room, I noticed the faint outlines of footprints in the dust leading toward a door at the back of the house. Against all logic, I followed them. The door creaked open to reveal a staircase spiraling downward into darkness. A cold draft swept up from below, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and decay. Every rational thought told me to turn back, but an inexplicable pull drove me forward. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to pierce the shadows. The steps groaned under my weight as I descended. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my chest, and the walls seemed to close in around me. At the bottom of the stairs was a narrow corridor lined with doors, each identical and unmarked. I paused, unsure which to open, when the faint sound of a child's laughter echoed through the hallway. It came from the farthest door. My pulse raced as I moved toward it, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The laughter stopped abruptly as I reached the door, replaced by a heavy silence. My fingers hesitated on the doorknob, slick with sweat despite the chill. When I finally mustered the courage to push it open, the door swung inward with a groan, revealing a small, circular room. In the center of the room was a wooden rocking chair, swaying gently back and forth as though recently occupied. The walls were covered in strange, intricate carvings that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. My flashlight flickered, casting unsettling shadows that danced across the room. Then I saw it. In the corner, barely visible in the weak light, stood a figure. Small and pale, it resembled a child, but something was horribly wrong. Its limbs were too long, its eyes too large and black, like endless voids. It tilted its head as though studying me, and a low, guttural sound emanated from its throat. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. Darkness consumed the room, and the hum grew deafening, vibrating through my bones. Panic surged through me as I scrambled for the flashlight, my fingers fumbling in the pitch black. When the light flickered back on, the figure was gone, but the rocking chair had stopped moving. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted from the room, my footsteps echoing wildly in the corridor. As I reached the base of the stairs, the hum suddenly stopped. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I climbed the stairs two at a time, desperate to escape, but when I reached the top, the house was no longer the same. The hallway stretched infinitely in both directions, and the once dim light was now an unnatural red that bathed everything in a sinister glow. I was trapped, and the house was alive. The hallway stretched into an impossible void, its walls pulsating faintly as though breathing. The rain outside had faded into a distant whisper, replaced by a low thrum that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the house. My legs felt leaden as I stumbled forward, driven by the primal need to escape. But where was there to go when the very fabric of reality seemed to bend and twist around me? I turned back toward the staircase, but it was gone. In its place stood another door, tall and black, with intricate carvings that writhed as I stared at them. They seemed almost alive, shifting into shapes my mind couldn't comprehend. My breath quickened as the carvings formed symbols that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. My trembling hand reached for the doorknob, slick and cold under my fingers. A voice, faint and fragmented, whispered just behind me. It wasn't a language I recognized, but its tone was laced with warning. I spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping across the hallway, but there was no one there. The red glow had deepened, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to mock my fear. I had no choice but to open the door. The knob turned with a metallic groan, and the door swung inward to reveal a room unlike any I'd seen before. It was vast, impossibly so, far larger than the confines of the house should have allowed. The ceiling arched high above, disappearing into darkness, and the walls were lined with bookshelves that stretched endlessly. The air was thick with the scent of ancient paper and something else, something acrid and metallic. In the center of the room stood a table, its surface etched with the same writhing symbols as the door. On the table lay an open book, its pages glowing faintly. As I approached, the hum returned, louder and more insistent. The words on the pages were written in a language I couldn't understand, yet they seemed to call to me, pulling me closer. I reached out, my fingers hovering above the pages, when the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath formed visible clouds, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Slowly, I turned, and my heart nearly stopped. The figure from the basement was there, standing motionless in the doorway. Its hollow black eyes bore into me, unblinking, and its grotesque form seemed to shimmer as though caught between worlds. It took a single, jerky step forward, and the door slammed shut behind it. Paralyzed with terror, I stumbled backward, bumping into the table. The figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. The hum grew deafening, drowning out my frantic thoughts. I grabbed the book instinctively, clutching it to my chest, and the glow intensified, bathing the room in blinding light. The figure let out a guttural scream, a sound that pierced through the hum and rattled in my skull. The light from the book expanded, enveloping everything in a searing flash. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no sensation, just an endless void. When I came to, I was lying on the cold, dusty floor of the manor's main hallway. The red glow was gone, replaced by the faint light of the storm outside. The rain had returned, its rhythmic patter soothing in its normalcy. For a fleeting moment, I thought I had escaped. Then I saw the book, still clutched in my hands. Its glow had faded, but the symbols on its cover seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. A deep sense of dread settled over me as I realized that the hum was still there, faint but persistent, like an echo that refused to fade. The house was quiet now, but it didn't feel empty. It felt aware. I stood, my legs unsteady, and turned toward the front door. It was there, just as I had left it, slightly ajar. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled toward it, the book clutched tightly against my chest. The moment my fingers touched the doorknob, a voice, soft and melodic, whispered in my ear, "Stay." It wasn't a request, it was a command. The door slammed shut, and the hum surged, vibrating through the walls. The air grew heavy, and the hallway seemed to stretch again, the red glow creeping back into the edges of my vision. I backed away from the door, heart racing, and turned to face the manor once more. The house wasn't going to let me leave. Not yet. The hallway seemed to shift and twist as I walked, each step taking me deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the house. Doors appeared and vanished, leading to rooms that defied logic. One moment, I was in what seemed to be an abandoned nursery, the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. The next, I found myself in a cavernous ballroom, its once grand chandeliers now draped with cobwebs. Time and space held no meaning here. In every room, I felt it watching. The figure never appeared again, but its presence lingered, oppressive and inescapable. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and the whispers grew louder, their fragmented words burrowing into my mind. They spoke of things I couldn't understand, of ancient pacts and forgotten gods, of sacrifices and eternal hunger. At the center of it all was the book. The more I held it, the more I felt its weight, not just physical, but spiritual. It was as though the book was alive, feeding off my fear. I wanted to throw it away, to leave it behind, but some invisible force kept it in my grasp. I lost track of how long I wandered. Hours, days. Time had become meaningless. My flashlight's battery finally died, plunging me into darkness, but the faint glow from the book provided just enough light to see by. The hum had become a constant companion, a dark lullaby that seemed to resonate with the rhythm of my heartbeat. Eventually, I found myself back in the circular room from the basement. The rocking chair was gone, but the walls were still covered in those writhing carvings. In the center of the room was a new object, a mirror, tall and ornate, its surface unnaturally smooth. My reflection stared back at me, but something was wrong. The eyes in the mirror weren't mine. They were black, endless voids, just like the figures. As I stared, transfixed, the whispers rose to a crescendo, and the hum became deafening. The room seemed to collapse inward, the walls twisting and stretching as the mirror began to glow. My reflection reached out, its black eyes filled with malice, and the last thing I saw before the world went dark was its hand breaching the surface of the glass. I awoke to silence. No hum, no whispers, not even the sound of rain. The oppressive darkness had lifted, replaced by a dim, cold light. My head throbbed, and every muscle in my body ached as though I had been dragged through a nightmare made real. Slowly, I sat up, my hands brushing against icy stone. The room was unfamiliar. The walls were bare, carved from rough, black stone that seemed to absorb what little light there was. No doors, no windows, just an endless, suffocating void. I looked down and realized the book was still with me, lying open on the floor. Its pages no longer glowed, but the ink seemed alive, swirling in intricate patterns that defied comprehension. For the first time, I noticed my reflection again, not in glass or water, but in the surface of the book's pages. My face stared back at me, twisted and distorted, my eyes ringed with dark hollows. The longer I stared, the more the reflection changed. My face melted into something unrecognizable, a shifting, grotesque amalgamation of features. With a gasp, I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding. The silence was unnatural. It pressed against my ears, making me long for even the maddening hum. As I struggled to regain my composure, I became aware of something in the room with me. It wasn't visible, at least, not directly, but its presence was undeniable. A cold, heavy weight hung in the air, and every instinct screamed at me that I wasn't alone. Who's there? My voice cracked, breaking the oppressive silence. There was no answer, but the atmosphere shifted. A faint sound, like the rustle of dry leaves, began to echo through the room. It was subtle at first, but it grew louder, circling me, closing in. Shadows crept across the walls, moving against the faint light. Then, a voice, soft, melodic, and achingly familiar. "Why did you come here?" I froze. It wasn't just any voice, it was mine, but it carried an edge of malice, a cold detachment that made my skin crawl. The shadows on the walls coalesced, forming a shape, a tall, distorted figure that mimicked my form but stretched unnaturally, its limbs long and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face was a blank void, except for the mouth. "Answer me," it whispered, the sound reverberating through the room like the toll of a distant bell. I don't know," I stammered, backing away. "I didn't mean to. I was lost." The figure tilted its head further, as though considering my words. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, impossibly wide, filled with rows of needle-like teeth. "Lost," it echoed, its voice dripping with mockery. "You entered this place of your own will. Now it claims you." The book began to hum in my hands, vibrating with a malevolent energy. I wanted to throw it away, to be rid of it forever, but my hands refused to obey. The book was a part of me now, as much as my own flesh. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, tears burning my eyes. The figure's grin widened, splitting its face in two. "You've already given it everything." Suddenly, the walls began to tremble, the stone groaning as though alive. Cracks formed, spreading like veins, and a sickly red light seeped through. The room was collapsing, folding in on itself, and the figure began to dissolve into the shadows, its laughter echoing long after it was gone. I clutched the book tightly as the ground beneath me gave way. There was no time to scream, no time to think, only the sensation of falling into a bottomless abyss. When I landed, the impact knocked the air from my lungs. The world around me was different, no longer confined to stone walls. I was in a forest, but it was unlike any I had ever seen. The trees were twisted and black, their branches like skeletal arms reaching toward an empty, starless sky. The air was thick and cold, carrying the faint stench of decay. The hum returned, faint and distant, like a heartbeat pulsing through the earth. I staggered to my feet, gripping the book like a lifeline. It no longer felt like a possession. It felt like a curse. As I walked through the forest, the ground squelched beneath my boots, wet and sticky with a substance I dared not examine too closely. The shadows between the trees shifted unnaturally, as though watching me. I felt their eyes, their malice, their hunger. Time blurred in this place. The forest seemed endless, a maze of dark paths and suffocating silence. I lost track of how long I wandered, my mind teetering on the edge of collapse. Then I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, flickering like a dying flame. Hope flared in my chest, fragile and fleeting. I stumbled toward it, my steps quickening as the light grew brighter. The source of the glow was a clearing, and in its center stood a figure cloaked in light. It was humanoid, but its features were obscured, its form shifting and ethereal. It radiated an aura of calm that contrasted sharply with the oppressive forest. "You carry the burden," it said, its voice soft and resonant, echoing in my mind. I held up the book, desperation choking my words. "What is this? How do I get rid of it?" The figure tilted its head, its light dimming slightly. "The book is not yours to discard. It is a key, and you are its keeper." "A key to what?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "To the truth," the figure replied. "To a power beyond comprehension. But beware, the key opens many doors, and not all should be unlocked." I fell to my knees, the weight of the revelation crushing me. "I didn't ask for this. I don't want it." The figure's light flickered, and its tone turned grave. "It is no longer a matter of want. The house has chosen you, as it has chosen many before. You cannot escape it." The hum grew louder, vibrating through the clearing. The figure began to fade, its light swallowed by the encroaching darkness. "Find the final door," it said, its voice growing faint. "Only then will you understand." Before I could ask more, the figure vanished, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence once again. The forest seemed to close in around me, and the book grew heavier in my hands. Somewhere in the distance, the laughter of a child echoed, mingling with the hum. The house wasn't done with me. Not yet. The forest's oppressive silence wrapped around me, broken only by the faint echo of a child's laughter in the distance. It wasn't joyful. It was hollow, fragmented, as if carried by a wind that didn't belong. The book, heavier now, pulsed faintly in my hands, a reminder of the weight I carried, of the door I had to find. The figure's parting words echoed in my mind. The final door. What door? Where? Every direction in this twisted forest looked the same, an endless expanse of darkness and decay. I was a prisoner in a maze designed to break me. I started moving again, guided by some deep, primal instinct. The laughter came and went, each burst sounding closer than the last. My footsteps slowed as I reached a clearing. It was small and unnatural, the ground bare and cracked as though the earth itself had recoiled. In the center stood a tree, gnarled and ancient, its bark blackened and brittle, and carved into it was a door. It was tall and narrow, its surface etched with those same shifting symbols that adorned the book. As I approached, the pulsing in the book grew stronger, syncing with the hum that resonated through the clearing. My chest tightened. This was it. The air grew colder with every step I took, my breath fogging in the dim light. The laughter was gone now, replaced by a low murmur that surrounded me, voices whispering in a language I couldn't understand. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door. The moment my hand touched the bark, the world shifted. I wasn't in the forest anymore. The door had led me into a vast, circular chamber that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The walls were impossibly high, lined with shelves overflowing with ancient books and artifacts that glowed faintly. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and something else, something metallic and sharp. At the center of the room stood a pedestal. On it rested a mirror, its surface smooth and black, reflecting nothing but an endless void. The hum was louder here, almost deafening, and the book in my hands vibrated violently, as though desperate to be released. I approached the pedestal slowly, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the cavernous space. The whispers had returned, louder and more insistent, their fragmented words clawing at my mind. "End it," one voice hissed. "Begin," whispered another. My hands moved on their own, placing the book on the pedestal beside the mirror. The moment the book touched the surface, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than any sound. Then the mirror came to life. Its surface rippled like water, and my reflection appeared, distorted and grotesque. My face twisted into an expression of agony, my eyes black and hollow. The reflection smiled, its teeth jagged and wrong, and leaned closer, as though trying to step through the glass. "You're not ready," it said in my voice, warped and echoing. "But you will be." I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the mirror began to crack. Thin fractures spread across its surface, glowing with a fiery red light. The book on the pedestal burst open, its pages flipping wildly as though caught in a gale. The hum returned, louder than ever, a deafening roar that threatened to split me in two. The light from the mirror consumed the room, and the last thing I saw before the world dissolved was my reflection, smiling, waiting, stepping through the glass. When I woke, I was back in the manor. The hallways were as I remembered, dark and decayed, but something had changed. The air felt alive, charged with an energy that prickled my skin. The book was gone, but I could still feel its weight, as though it had been absorbed into me. And the hum, it was inside me now, resonating in my very bones. The final door wasn't in the forest or the chamber. It was here in the house, and I had to find it. The hum inside me grew louder with every step I took through the house. The walls seemed to breathe now, pulsing faintly as if alive. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and the air felt heavy, charged with an unseen force. I didn't need to search for the final door. I could feel it calling me. My body moved as if guided, my feet treading a path I couldn't see but somehow knew. Hallways twisted and stretched, rooms bled into one another, and time unraveled. Yet I pressed on, driven by something beyond fear or logic. At last, I stood before it. The door was ancient, carved into the wall as though it had grown there. Its surface shimmered, rippling like water, and the symbols etched into it burned faintly, alive with a sinister glow. My chest tightened as the hum swelled, drowning out everything else. Without hesitation, I reached out. The door pulled me in, its surface cold and endless. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world vanished, replaced by an abyss of light and shadow. And in the heart of the void, something waited. The hum inside me grew louder with every step I took through the house. The walls seemed to breathe now, pulsing faintly as if alive. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and the air felt heavy, charged with an unseen force. I didn't need to search for the final door. I could feel it calling me. My body moved as if guided, my feet treading a path I couldn't see but somehow knew. Hallways twisted and stretched, rooms bled into one another, and time unraveled. Yet I pressed on, driven by something beyond fear or logic. At last, I stood before it. The door was ancient, carved into the wall as though it had grown there. Its surface shimmered, rippling like water, and the symbols etched into it burned faintly, alive with a sinister glow. My chest tightened as the hum swelled, drowning out everything else. Without hesitation, I reached out. The door pulled me in, its surface cold and endless. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world vanished, replaced by an abyss of light and shadow. And in the heart of the void, something waited. The void was unlike anything I could have imagined, neither dark nor light, but a shifting, endless expanse of both. Shapes moved at the edges of my vision, massive and incomprehensible, their presence oppressive and suffocating. The hum inside me had become a roar, an unbearable resonance that vibrated through my very soul. At the center of it all, a figure loomed. It wasn't like the shadowy shapes that had stalked me before. This was something far greater, an entity woven from the fabric of the void itself. Its form was ever-changing, limbs appearing and dissolving, a face shifting between countless expressions, none of them human. It spoke, not in words, but in sensations. A flood of images, emotions, and whispers that bypassed my ears and seared directly into my mind. "You carry the key," it said, its voice a cacophony of countless others. "You have unlocked what should remain sealed." I didn't want this, I shouted, my voice trembling under the weight of its presence. "You were chosen," it replied, its form leaning closer. "The house seeks a keeper, and it has found you. Will you accept your place, or will you be consumed? The book appeared in my hands, though I hadn't brought it here. Its pages glowed faintly, the symbols shifting into something I could almost understand. The weight of its power was undeniable, pressing against my chest, daring me to act. I had no choice. I opened the book. The void erupted with light, and the hum exploded into silence. For a moment, I was everything and nothing, my body dissolving into the infinite. When the sensation faded, I stood alone in the manor once more. But it wasn't the same. The walls pulsed with a faint red glow, and the air vibrated with an energy that was both alien and familiar. The house was alive, and it was mine now. The final door had closed, but the manor's secrets were only beginning to unravel. The silence in the manor was heavy, pressing against me like a physical weight. The red glow that now emanated from the walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. Or was it the houses? I couldn't tell anymore. Everything felt different, as though the boundaries between myself and the manor had blurred. The book, still in my hands, felt warm now, as if it were breathing. Its cover was no longer smooth, but pulsed faintly, like flesh stretched over bone. The symbols etched into it no longer shifted aimlessly. Instead, they formed coherent patterns, paths I felt compelled to follow. My footsteps echoed as I moved through the hallways, though I wasn't sure I was walking anymore. The house guided me. Doors opened without my touch, their hinges creaking like voices calling me forward. The rooms I passed weren't the decayed, forgotten spaces I had wandered through before. Now, they pulsed with an eerie vitality. I entered what seemed to be a library, though it was unlike any library I had ever seen. The shelves towered into infinity, packed with books whose titles I couldn't read but felt as though I already knew. The air was thick with the scent of ancient parchment and something metallic, sharp. The hum returned, softer now, a low vibration that resonated deep within my chest. On the central table lay an object covered in a black cloth. I hesitated, but the book in my hands grew heavier, urging me forward. With trembling fingers, I pulled the cloth away to reveal a mirror, smaller than the one I'd seen before but no less unsettling. Its surface was perfectly smooth, reflecting the room around me, though my own image was absent. The hum grew louder as the mirror began to ripple. Slowly, shapes began to form within its surface. At first, they were indistinct, shadows twisting and colliding. Then, they solidified. Faces emerged, dozens of them, their features warped by terror. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their eyes hollow and pleading. A voice spoke, soft and echoing, as though coming from deep within the house. These are the lost, those who came before you and failed. My throat tightened. Failed what? To become one with the house, to accept its will. The faces in the mirror shifted, replaced by a single, familiar figure. It was me, or at least it looked like me. The reflection's eyes were black voids, its smile stretched too wide. It stared at me, unblinking, as the voice continued. You are the chosen keeper. You must decide. Decide what? I demanded, my voice trembling. The reflection's smile widened as it pressed its hands against the inside of the glass. To open the final page, or to take their place. The book in my hands began to glow, its warmth turning to heat. The hum rose to a deafening crescendo, and the walls of the library seemed to close in, the shelves bending and twisting like they were alive. I looked down at the book. Its pages were turning on their own, faster and faster, until they stopped at the very last one. The symbols on the page burned with a fiery light, and I felt a surge of energy so powerful it brought me to my knees. The reflection spoke again, its voice now a perfect echo of mine. Choose. I gripped the book tightly, my mind racing. If I opened the final page, I had no idea what would happen. But if I refused, the faces in the mirror, their hollow eyes, their silent screams, told me exactly what my fate would be. The symbols on the last page seemed to writhe, as if alive, begging me to release whatever power they contained. My hand moved on its own, my fingers tracing the lines of ink that glowed brighter with every touch. The room shook violently, the walls cracking and groaning as the house itself seemed to react. The faces in the mirror began to wail, their screams piercing through the hum, and the reflection of myself pressed harder against the glass, its grin splitting its face in two. "Open it!" it screamed. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The book felt like it was alive in my hands, a creature writhing and twisting. I opened the final page. The room exploded with light, blinding and all-consuming. I felt the world around me collapse, the floor dissolving beneath my feet. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no sight, no sensation. Then, I was standing in a new room. This space was unlike anything I had seen before. It was vast, infinite, and filled with an eerie, pale light. The floor was smooth, reflective, as though I were standing on the surface of a still lake. In the center of the room stood a throne, carved from black stone and pulsating with the same red glow as the walls of the manor. And sitting on the throne was the figure I had seen in the void. It stared at me with eyes that seemed to contain galaxies, its form constantly shifting between shapes I couldn't comprehend. The book in my hands dissolved into ash, and the hum inside me ceased. "You have accepted," it said, its voice 1,000 voices in one. "You are the keeper now. The house is yours, and you are its." I wanted to speak, to protest, but the weight of its presence crushed the words in my throat. Slowly, the figure rose, its towering form dwarfing me. It extended a hand, long and skeletal, and placed it on my chest. A searing pain shot through me, and I screamed as the light of the room consumed everything once more. When I woke, I was back in the manor. The halls were silent, the air heavy, but everything was different. I could feel the house breathing, its pulse synchronized with my own. I wasn't just in the house, I was part of it now, and somewhere, deep within its walls, I could hear the laughter of the lost, waiting for the next soul to stumble through its doors. The manor was silent now, its oppressive hum replaced by an eerie stillness. I felt it moving within me, as though its walls and corridors were now stitched into my very being. The weight of the house, its power and its malice, was mine to bear. I walked slowly through the familiar yet alien hallways, my footsteps echoing into the void of its vast, endless interior. The red glow was faint now, pulsing gently like a heartbeat at rest. Doors opened and closed at my will. I no longer touched the handles. I didn't need to. The house obeyed me. Yet, deep in the shadows, I could feel them, the lost souls, their presence lingering in every corner, behind every door. They whispered to me, their voices faint and mournful. They weren't angry, not yet, but they were waiting. The first sign of what I had truly become came when I stumbled upon the old nursery. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a room covered in dust and cobwebs. A single rocking chair sat in the center, its movement slow and deliberate, though no one was seated there. A faint melody filled the air, the kind of lullaby meant to soothe a restless child but warped, its notes twisting into something dissonant. The cradle beside the chair was empty, but I felt the weight of something watching me. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of anguish. "Help us," one voice pleaded, soft and broken. "Why did you take us?" another demanded, filled with rage. I stepped back, my hands trembling. I didn't do this," I whispered, but the words felt hollow. The house answered for me. The room shifted, its walls stretching and contorting as the cradle began to rock violently. The whispers became screams, filling the space with a deafening roar. The rocking chair flew back, slamming into the wall, and a shadowy figure rose from the cradle. It was small, its form twisted and malformed, its face obscured by darkness. It pointed at me, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze piercing through me. "You are the keeper," it said, its voice layered with countless others. "You carry their pain. I didn't ask for this," I shouted, stepping back into the hallway. The shadow figure reached toward me, and for a moment I thought it would attack. But instead, it dissolved into a cloud of smoke, its screams fading into the distance. The rocking chair and cradle stood still, and the room returned to its silent, lifeless state. But the weight of what I had seen lingered. I continued wandering, the house reshaping itself as I moved. It was endless now, no longer bound by the physical dimensions it once obeyed. I passed through rooms that seemed to belong to other times, other worlds. Decayed banquet halls filled with skeletal figures slumped at the table, a chapel with pews that bled black ichor, a ballroom where ghostly couples danced in silence. Everywhere I went, I felt their eyes, the lost, the damned, and I understood. The manor wasn't just alive, it was a prison. It fed on those who entered, trapping their souls and twisting their forms. It had done so for centuries, perhaps longer, and now it had made me its keeper. I stopped in front of a mirror that hung in one of the grand halls. This time, my reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't the me I remembered. My eyes were hollow, my skin pale, my features sharp and inhuman. "You're becoming it," the reflection whispered, its mouth moving without mine. "Piece by piece, you'll disappear, until all that remains is the house." "No," I said, my voice shaking. "I can stop this." The reflection laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that reverberated through the hall. "You can't stop what you've already begun. The house is you now, and you are it. But don't worry, Keeper. Soon there will be another." The realization hit me like a blow. The house would wait. It always waited. The next traveler would come, drawn by the whispers, the promise of answers, the allure of forbidden knowledge. And I would be there, as the keeper, to guide them deeper into its grasp. For now, I wandered the endless halls, learning the house's secrets, feeling its power grow within me. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps. Someone was coming. Someone new. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly through the manor, distant yet distinct. They grew louder, steadier, resonating with a strange rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the pulse of the house itself. I stood in the grand hall, its vaulted ceiling stretching into shadows, waiting. I wasn't sure how long I'd been there. Time had ceased to have meaning. lost in the endless corridors and shifting rooms of the manor. But now, the house was waking again, stirring as its next visitor approached. The door at the far end of the hall creaked open slowly, the sound reverberating through the silent expanse. A figure stepped inside, a man, perhaps in his early 40s, his face drawn and pale. His clothes were damp from the storm raging outside, and he clutched a flashlight that flickered weakly, as if already succumbing to the manor's will. I watched from the shadows, unseen yet deeply aware of his presence. The house whispered to me, its murmurs filling my mind. It was hungry again, eager to ensnare its newest prey. The man hesitated, his breath visible in the cold air, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Hello," he called, his voice trembling. "Is someone here?" The house responded with a low groan, the walls shifting subtly as if inhaling. I felt its energy course through me, compelling me to act. My role was clear. I was no longer just a part of the manor. I was its keeper, its guide, its lure. I stepped forward, allowing the dim light of his flashlight to catch me. His eyes widened as he saw me, his body tensing. "You're not supposed to be here," I said, my voice calm yet layered with something deeper, something that wasn't entirely mine. I got lost," he stammered, taking a cautious step back. "The storm. I just needed shelter." "There's no shelter here," I replied, the words coming unbidden. "Only what you bring with you." The man's breathing quickened as he glanced around, the oppressive atmosphere of the house beginning to weigh on him. I could see the fear in his eyes, the way his grip on the flashlight tightened as though it could somehow protect him. But the house didn't need him to run. It needed him to stay. "You should leave," I said, knowing full well the doors were already gone, the manor's labyrinthine halls reshaping themselves to trap him. I don't understand," he muttered, his voice shaking. "What is this place?" I wanted to tell him the truth, to warn him of what was coming, but the house wouldn't let me. Its whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts, pushing me forward. Instead, I gestured toward the hallway that stretched into darkness. "Go. There's an exit if you keep walking." The man hesitated, his instincts warring with his desperation. Finally, he nodded and stepped past me, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. I stayed behind, watching as the shadows swallowed him whole. The house began its work. I could feel it shifting around him, bending its walls and corridors to confuse and disorient. The man's breathing grew louder, more panicked, as he realized the hallway stretched endlessly, each door he tried locked or leading to an empty void. "Hello," he called again, his voice rising in pitch. "Is anyone there? Please." The whispers began, faint at first, just enough to make him glance over his shoulder. The house was clever, subtle, giving him just enough of a sense of unease to keep him moving deeper into its grasp. I followed at a distance, unseen but ever present. I wasn't sure why. Perhaps a part of me still hoped to save him, or perhaps I simply wanted to see what the house would do. The man entered a room at the end of the hall, its door creaking open as if inviting him in. It was one of the manor's many tricks, a nursery untouched by time, its rocking chair swaying gently in the center. A faint lullaby played from an unseen source, its melody sweet but distorted. The man froze in the doorway, his flashlight flickering. What is this?" he whispered, stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind him. I stood outside the room, listening to his screams. They were muffled at first, as though coming from far away, but they grew louder, more desperate, until they were abruptly cut off. When I opened the door, the room was empty. The rocking chair was still. The lullaby had stopped. The man was gone. His presence absorbed into the house. I felt it settle once more, its hunger sated, at least for now. But something was different. The whispers that had always surrounded me were quieter now, almost reverent. The house's energy felt stronger, more complete, as though it had taken more than just the man's soul. It had taken something vital from him, something it had been missing, and I realized with a sinking dread that the house wasn't just alive, it was evolving. I returned to the grand hall, the manor's pulse steady and calm. The storm outside had subsided, leaving only silence in its wake. As I stood there, I felt a strange sense of peace, of belonging. The house was no longer a prison, but a part of me, and I a part of it. But deep within its walls, I could feel the stirrings of something new, something far more dangerous than the manor had ever been before. And I knew, eventually, someone else would come. They always did, and I would be waiting. The quiet after the manor's feeding was deceptive, a stillness that concealed the storm brewing within its walls. I could feel it pulsing beneath my skin, a deeper, hungrier energy that surged with each passing moment. Though I had been the keeper for what felt like an eternity, I was beginning to realize that my role wasn't just to guide the house's prey. No, it was something far worse. I wasn't merely a servant of the house. I was its experiment. The discovery came as I wandered into a part of the manor I had never seen before. This happened often. The house's labyrinth seemed infinite, always rearranging itself, presenting new rooms as it pleased. But this place was different. The air grew heavier as I moved through narrow corridors lined with strange carvings. Symbols similar to those in the book I had carried marked the walls, glowing faintly as I passed. They seemed alive, pulsating like veins feeding the house's heart. The corridor ended at a massive iron door, its surface cold and unyielding. For a moment, I hesitated. The whispers in my head had grown louder, but they weren't the familiar voices of the lost souls. No, these were sharper, more forceful, commanding me forward. The door opened with a groan as I approached, revealing a vast chamber bathed in a sickly green light. The floor was made of black stone, smooth and reflective, and the air buzzed with a low hum that resonated in my chest. In the center of the room stood an altar, carved from the same black stone as the floor. Above it hung a massive, jagged crystal, suspended in midair by invisible forces. It pulsed with light, its glow synchronized with the heartbeat of the house. I approached cautiously, the whispers growing louder until they were deafening. The moment I touched the altar, a searing pain shot through my body. My vision blurred, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single voice, deep, resonant, and inescapable. "You are not just the keeper," it said, its tone vibrating through my very bones. "You are the vessel." What does that mean? I managed to choke out. The crystal above me flared brightly, and the room was flooded with visions. I saw the manor as it once was, a grand, beautiful estate filled with life and laughter. Then I saw its descent into darkness, the corruption spreading like a disease, consuming everything and everyone within its walls. And at the center of it all, I saw the crystal. It wasn't a part of the house, it was the house. The physical manifestation of its essence, its power, and its hunger. The keeper, I realized, wasn't just a guardian. The keeper was meant to become the crystal's host, a conduit through which it could expand its influence beyond the manor's walls. I pulled away from the altar, my breath ragged. "No," I whispered. "I won't let you use me." The voice laughed, a sound that echoed endlessly in the chamber. "You have no choice. The process has already begun. With every soul you deliver, you grow closer to becoming one with me." I stumbled back into the corridor, the weight of the revelation pressing down on me. The manor wasn't just a trap for the unwary. It was a parasite, and I was its next host. The thought filled me with dread, but it also ignited a spark of defiance. If I was to be consumed, then I would fight. I wouldn't go quietly into the darkness. As I moved through the twisting halls, I began to notice changes in the manor. The walls no longer shifted as they once did. Instead, they seemed to ripple, as though resisting my presence. The whispers of the lost grew more frantic, their voices pleading for release. For the first time since I'd become the keeper, the house seemed afraid. I found myself back in the library, its towering shelves stretching into infinity. The books glowed faintly, their pages filled with knowledge I had never dared to seek. But now, I knew I needed answers. The book I had carried before was gone, its power absorbed into me during my transformation. But I felt its essence here, among the countless volumes. I reached for a book that seemed to hum with familiarity, its cover marked with the same shifting symbols as the crystal. When I opened it, the pages glowed brightly, and the words rearranged themselves into something I could understand. The book spoke of the crystal's origins, a relic from another world, brought here by those who sought to harness its power. But it had turned on its creators, consuming them and binding itself to the manor, creating an endless cycle of death and rebirth. And the only way to destroy it was to sever its connection to the keeper. I stared at the book, my mind racing. Severing the connection would destroy me as well. I was too deeply bound to the house. But it would free the souls it had trapped, and it would end the cycle. The choice was clear. The manor trembled as I made my way back to the crystal chamber. The walls groaned, and the air grew colder, as though the house itself was trying to stop me. But I pushed forward, the whispers of the lost urging me on. When I reached the chamber, the crystal flared angrily, its light blinding. The voice returned, booming and furious. "You cannot defy me," it roared. I stepped forward, the book clutched tightly in my hands. "You've fed on enough lives. It ends now." The crystal's light pulsed wildly, and the room began to collapse around me. But I didn't stop. I climbed onto the altar, the book's pages glowing brighter with every step. I pressed the book against the crystal, its light merging with the pages. The whispers of the lost turned into a deafening roar, a chorus of voices crying out in unison. The crystal shattered, its light exploding outward in a wave of blinding energy. I felt the manor collapse around me, its power unraveling, its essence dissolving into nothingness. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the forest, the ruins of the manor behind me. The air was still, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was free. But the cost had been great. The faces of the lost lingered in my mind, their voices fading into silence. And though the manor was gone, I knew its shadow would remain, a scar on the fabric of reality. For now, though, the nightmare was over, or so I thought. The forest was eerily quiet. The storm had passed, leaving a soft mist hanging in the air, weaving through the trees like a memory. My heart still raced, my body numb from the ordeal, but there was no longer any sign of the manor. No towering stone walls, no glowing lights, nothing but the rustling leaves and the distant cries of birds waking from their fright. I looked around, half expecting the manor to reappear, its twisted form rising from the earth as if mocking me, but it remained gone, as though it had never existed at all. The weight in my chest, the weight of the house's oppressive presence, had lifted, leaving an emptiness in its place. I let out a long breath. It was over. The cycle had been broken. The souls had been freed. And the crystal, the heart of the house, had shattered. I had done it. I had ended it. Or had I? The first sign that something wasn't right came when I looked down at my hands. They trembled slightly, but it wasn't just fear. There was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible pull. A connection to something I couldn't see but could feel deep within me. The feeling was so subtle at first that I brushed it off as the remnants of the terror I had just endured. But as I stood there in the quiet forest, I couldn't shake the sensation that the ground beneath me wasn't quite solid. I glanced behind me. The place where the manor had once stood was empty, the air clear and calm. No ominous shadows, no hidden doors, no distant whispers calling to me from the depths of the house. But the forest felt different, unnaturally still, like a world suspended between two realities. I took a step forward, the sensation in my chest growing stronger, like a pull, like an invisible thread that tethered me to something far beyond this world. I kept walking. Hours passed. At least I thought they did. I lost track of time, moving through the forest without thinking. The trees were thick now, the air heavier, colder. The pull in my chest became a constant thrum, growing louder with each step. I tried to shake it off. The manor had been destroyed, I told myself. The book was gone, the crystal shattered. There was no reason to feel this way, but I couldn't stop. I found myself following the pull, deeper into the woods, until the trees began to thin, revealing a small clearing. At the center of the clearing was something strange, an ancient stone circle, its edges worn smooth with time. It stood in stark contrast to the surrounding forest, as though it had been placed here long before the trees had begun to grow. A single stone pillar stood at its center, black and twisted, as if the stone had been scorched by some long-forgotten fire. The pull was unbearable now, tugging at my very soul. I approached the stone circle slowly, almost hesitantly. The air felt thick here, the weight of something ancient pressing down on me. I reached out, my fingers grazing the cool stone. And suddenly, the world around me shifted. The forest was gone. The sky above was no longer the soft, pale blue of a clear day, but a swirling mass of black clouds, flashing with purple lightning. The air was heavy, dense with an energy I could taste in my mouth. The ground beneath my feet was now an endless sea of cracked earth, stretching into an endless horizon. I wasn't in the forest anymore. I was back in the heart of the manor. The stone circle had transported me, somehow, back into the very essence of the house. I felt the pulse of it beneath my feet, the beat of its dark heart reverberating through the earth. But something was different now. The house felt alive in a way it never had before. The power it had once drawn from the souls trapped within its walls now seemed to flow outward, reaching across the land, through the very fabric of reality itself. And I was connected to it. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. The manor's twisted corridors were gone, but I could feel them, every inch of the house, its dark pulse running through me. I could hear its whispers, louder now, calling my name, pulling me deeper. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "This can't be real." But it was. I was back in the manor, and it wasn't done with me yet. I stumbled backward, but the pull was too strong. The manor had become a part of me, and I of it. The crystal, the heart of the house, may have shattered, but its power had transferred into me. I was no longer just the keeper. I was the anchor that held its existence to this world. And as the house's dark whispers filled my mind, I understood the truth. The manor was not just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, a parasitic force that thrived on the souls it consumed. The keeper was never meant to destroy it. The keeper was always meant to be consumed, to become the next vessel for the house's power. I had been tricked. The air around me grew colder, the sky above darker, as the shadows of the manor stretched out, blending with the storm clouds. The stone pillar in the center of the clearing began to glow with an otherworldly light, the same light I had seen in the manor's heart. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. "Welcome back, Keeper," a voice boomed in my mind, its tone rich and deep, like the voice of the manor itself. I tried to speak, to shout, but my voice was drowned by the power surging within me. I fell to my knees, clutching my chest as the pain of the transformation tore through me. I could feel the manor's influence weaving its way into every fiber of my being, reshaping me, binding me to it. "No," I gasped, my hands trembling. "I won't let you take me again." But the voice only laughed, a sound that echoed through the storm. "You are already ours, Keeper. The house never lets go." And then, as the storm raged around me, I felt it. The power of the manor coursing through my veins, spreading like fire through my blood. The stone pillar cracked and splintered, releasing an explosion of dark energy that surrounded me, engulfing everything in a flash of light. When the light faded, I was standing in a vast, empty hall, familiar yet unrecognizable. The walls were twisted, the floors cracked, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. But in the distance, I saw the shape of something familiar. The massive doors of the manor, their dark outline etched against the horizon. And behind me, I could feel the house waiting. I had become the new heart of the manor, and it had already begun to call its next victim. The manor wasn't just a place. It wasn't merely walls, doors, and corridors. It was alive, and now I was its beating heart. I turned slowly, my body numb but my mind still sharp, resisting the pull of the house's influence. The darkness around me stretched endlessly. No windows, no natural light, only the flicker of distant shadows, moving like living things. The walls seemed to breathe, and every crack, every crevice whispered something I couldn't understand. The deep rumbling in the house reverberated through me like a low hum, a song of despair, a song I had now become a part of. "Welcome home," the voice said again, deeper this time, the words reverberating inside my skull. It was the manor itself, communicating through the very air. "You belong here, Keeper." "No," I whispered, feeling the cold air creep through my skin, settling in my bones. I staggered forward, the energy of the house pressing against me like an invisible weight. The voices, hundreds of them, rose in chorus, soft at first, then louder. These were the souls that had been trapped, that had never been freed. Now they knew what I was. They knew that I was one of them, bound to the house just as they were. I stumbled through the darkness, my hand brushing against the walls. I needed to escape. I couldn't let this place consume me entirely. The house had already taken so much from me. My sense of freedom, my identity. But there had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break the cycle. The whispers became more urgent, more desperate. They weren't just the voices of the dead. They were something else, something ancient, something powerful. They will come for you, the voice echoed again, louder this time, surrounding me like a suffocating fog. You will not escape. This is where you belong. I clenched my fists, pushing through the panic that began to rise in my chest. I'm not like them, I thought desperately. I'm not one of them. I'm still me. I can still fight. But the truth was undeniable. I was part of the house now, a conduit for its power, an unwilling vessel. The connection to the manor pulsed within me, stronger than ever before. I stumbled into what appeared to be the grand hall, its towering arches dimly lit by a flickering light. The once grand chandeliers hung low from the ceiling, their crystals broken and dark, casting jagged shadows across the floor. But the air in here, it was different. It hummed with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The doors at the far end of the hall were wide open, leading into an endless black abyss. That was where I had to go, but I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my feet glued to the floor. The house had a hold on me now, a grip I couldn't break. Go on, the voice whispered, now gentle. Step forward. All will be revealed. I knew what it wanted. It wanted me to give in, to cross that threshold and allow it to claim me fully, to let the manor consume every part of me until there was nothing left. But I refused. I had come this far. I couldn't give up now. I turned away from the abyss, trying to fight against the force that pulled me toward it. I needed to find a way to destroy the manor, to sever the connection once and for all. As I moved deeper into the hall, I found a door to the side. It was a small, unassuming door, but there was something about it that called to me. The whispers grew louder as I approached, urging me to open it, to step inside. I hesitated, but something inside me, the last remaining flicker of my will, pushed me forward. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, weathered wood. The moment I touched the doorknob, a surge of energy shot through me, overwhelming my senses. I gasped, the house's dark power flooding every inch of me. But I forced the door open. What I saw on the other side nearly made me collapse in horror. The room was vast, a circular chamber with walls covered in strange ancient symbols that seemed to writhe and shift as I looked at them. At the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, upon which lay a single glowing object. The crystal, or what was left of it, the heart of the manor. Its shattered pieces were arranged carefully, each one pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light. The pieces were drawn together by invisible threads, as if the house itself was slowly trying to reassemble its heart. This was it. This was the source of the manor's power. The crystal had been broken before, but now it was trying to reform. But I had another idea. I could destroy it once and for all. If I could destroy the crystal, then maybe the house would die with it. I stepped forward, the floor beneath me groaning as though the house knew what I was about to do. I reached out for the closest shard, my fingers trembling. The moment I touched it, a burst of energy shot through me, sharp and searing. But I held on, ignoring the pain. The house's energy surged within me, but I resisted. I had to. Just as I gripped the shard, the ground trembled violently. The walls cracked, and I heard the whispers rise into a frenzied chorus. I looked up and saw something that made my blood run cold. The stone pedestal was shaking, the pieces of the crystal glowing brighter, faster. The room began to spin, and a dark, oppressive force crushed down on me. The house was fighting back, trying to protect itself. The entire manor trembled as though it was alive, writhing and clawing at the air. "You cannot destroy what is already part of you," the voice boomed, its tone furious, twisting with madness. "The house cannot be undone. You belong to it now." I clenched my teeth, gritting through the rising panic. I had to finish it. I couldn't stop now. I couldn't let the house win. With every ounce of strength I had left, I thrust the shard into the center of the crystal, plunging it deep into its core. The crystal exploded in a burst of light, a scream that rattled the very foundations of the house. The room seemed to collapse in on itself, the walls crumbling, the air burning with an intensity one could barely comprehend. I had done it. I had shattered the heart of the manor. But as the light faded, the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, angrier. The manor was not done with me yet. The air was thick with silence as the glowing remnants of the shattered crystal flickered and died. But the stillness did not last. No, the moment the light faded, the house seemed to exhale, a deep, slow breath that reverberated through the very walls of the room, and with it, the whispers returned. But this time, they were not faint or distant. They were angry, insistent, and they filled my mind like a flood. "You cannot undo what you have become," the voice rumbled, deep and full of malice. "You think you can destroy us? We are eternal. You are ours now." I stumbled back, the floor beneath me shifting like the surface of a black sea. The very ground seemed to be alive, its surface writhing with dark tendrils, pulling at my feet, as though the manor itself sought to drag me under. "No," I gasped, struggling against the overwhelming pressure. My body was trembling from the pain, from the power coursing through me, but I fought it. I wouldn't let it claim me. I had shattered the crystal. I had severed the heart of the manor. I had broken the very foundation of its power. Yet the house fought back with every ounce of strength it had left. And now I was paying the price. I looked up at the ceiling, which was beginning to crack, the stone breaking away in jagged chunks. Dark, twisting shapes emerged from the cracks, reaching for me, and I realized with horror that the house was no longer trying to defend itself. It was trying to reclaim me. The walls seemed to close in around me as the air grew heavier. The whispers grew louder, no longer a chorus but a maddened, chaotic symphony, each voice distinct, each pleading for something. Freedom, death, release, vengeance. But none of them were kind. None of them were compassionate. They were all trapped within the house, just like I was, their anguish endless, a part of the very fabric of this nightmare. And then, amid the chaos of sound and shifting stone, I saw it. The very thing I had hoped would never come to pass. The crystal, or what remained of it, began to move. The shards that had once been scattered across the pedestal were now slowly floating back toward one another, drawn together by an unseen force. The glowing fragments hovered in the air, swirling around in a twisted dance, gathering their strength once more. I realized with a growing sense of dread that the manor's power had not been destroyed. The crystal might have shattered, but it had been reborn. This was its resurrection, a dark, twisted rebirth that would only make it stronger. It was no longer just a house. It was an entity, a sentient force that fed on the energy of the keeper, on the souls it consumed, and it would never truly die. The ground trembled again, this time violently, and I fell to my knees. The house, no, the thing, was rebuilding itself, feeding on my resistance. The fragments of the crystal began to glow brighter, pulsing with an unnatural light, and as they came together, I felt the power of the manor reaching out to me once again. I could feel the tendrils of darkness curling around my mind, pulling me back, drawing me into its depths. I had to act quickly. If I let it complete the reconstruction, if I let it pull me back into its embrace, I would be lost forever. I stood, struggling against the pull that was now choking me, a weight pressing down on my chest. The whispers were deafening, as though they were inside my skull, urging me to embrace the house, to accept it, to let it consume me. I knew the truth now. The house wasn't just some cursed estate. It was a parasite, an ancient evil that existed beyond time. The keeper wasn't just its servant. The keeper was its vessel, its conduit to the world beyond. And once the keeper was consumed, the house would grow, spreading its darkness across the land, feeding on the souls of the living and the dead alike. I couldn't allow that to happen. I turned away from the crystal, feeling its pull, its seductive call, as though it were reaching out to me with every heartbeat. I had to destroy it, and I had to do it now. But how? The voices in my head were growing louder, filling every part of my mind, drowning me in their despair and rage. The house was angry now, furious at my defiance, and it made one final attempt to claim me. I could feel the pressure, the crushing weight of its power building in the air. The walls seemed to bend toward me, as if the house itself was coming alive to devour me. I gritted my teeth, willing my body to move. Then I remembered the book, the one I had carried all this time, the one with the cryptic symbols and the knowledge of the manor's twisted past. It was gone now, its pages burned into my skin, but the knowledge was still there. The key to destroying the house wasn't just in breaking the crystal. It was in severing the bond, the connection between me and the manor. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath. The whispers were still there, clawing at my mind, but I pushed them aside. I had to focus. The connection I felt to the house, that unnatural tether, it had to be cut. There had to be a way. I reached deep within myself, searching for that thread, that invisible link that bound me to the manor. It was faint, but I could feel it, like a cord tied around my heart. The crystal had tied me to it, and the house's power had been feeding on me, strengthening with every breath I took. If I could sever the link, the house would have no anchor. It would lose its hold on me and on the world. But to sever it, I needed to give up everything. I hesitated. The house was everything now. It had consumed my life, my identity, and part of my soul. But it could never have all of me. I wouldn't let it. With trembling hands, I reached deep inside, drawing on the last remnants of my strength. And with a final, desperate scream, I pulled. The world around me shook as the bond snapped, a powerful shockwave of energy cascading through the room. The ground cracked beneath me, and the crystal shattered once more, its pieces flying outward in every direction. The house screamed. The house died. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my body drenched in sweat, my muscles aching from the effort. The voices were gone. The whispers, the oppressive weight of the manor. They were no more. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was free. The air was still, and the darkness that had once swallowed the manor was lifting, replaced by the first rays of dawn. I had done it. The house, the curse, it was finally over. Or so I thought. As the first light of day filtered through the ruins of the manor, I stood, surveying the place where the nightmare had once lived. The mansion had crumbled, its walls collapsing into the earth, its foundation nothing but dust. And yet, I could still hear it. The faintest whisper, the faintest call. The whisper echoed faintly, like a memory slipping through my mind, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down my spine. I had destroyed the manor. The power had been severed, the connection broken, and yet the sound of that whisper, distant but persistent, lingered in the air. I stood motionless in the ruins of the manor, watching as the sun began to rise, casting pale light over the wreckage. The once imposing structure was nothing more than shattered stone, crumbled walls, and twisted metal. It should have been over. I should have felt relief, a sense of closure, but instead, there was a gnawing unease in the pit of my stomach. The ground beneath my feet still felt unstable. The whispers were gone, but the weight of their presence, the sensation of being watched, remained. There was something left. Something I couldn't yet see but could feel pressing at the edges of my mind, as though it were waiting. I took a deep breath, shaking my head. It's over, I told myself. The house is gone. But was it really? Could I ever truly escape it? I walked through the crumbling remains of the manor, my footsteps echoing hollowly in the vast silence. Every shattered window, every broken doorframe seemed to mock me with its emptiness. The once grand staircase was now a twisted heap of debris, and the walls were scarred, cracked, as though the house itself had been torn apart, piece by piece. Yet still, there was something about the place that felt alive. It was like the house had left a part of itself behind, a piece of its essence. A fragment that refused to die. I stumbled into the main hall, the place where I had first encountered the crystal. The stone pedestal was gone, but the floor was scorched, the remnants of the energy that had once filled the space still palpable in the air. There was no crystal now, no signs of the dark power that had radiated from it, but there was something else. A small, glimmering light flickered in the center of the room. I froze. It was faint, like the glow of a dying ember, but it was there, just barely visible against the dark floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it cautiously, unsure of what I would find. As I drew closer, I could see that it was a shard, small and delicate, glowing with an eerie, pulsating light. It was a fragment of the crystal, the very same crystal I had destroyed. I had shattered it, obliterated it, yet here was a piece of it, glowing as if it were still alive. I reached down, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The moment I touched it, I felt a surge of energy, like a spark that ignited deep within my chest. The power was back. It was faint, but unmistakable. The house, or whatever was left of it, was not gone. It had simply been waiting. The whisper returned, louder now, a voice that filled my mind, its tone twisted and mocking. You thought you had freed yourself. You thought you had destroyed us, it said, the words dripping with malicious satisfaction. But the house is not so easily killed. And now, you are mine, I gasped, stumbling backward as the shard burned in my hand. The ground trembled beneath me, and the walls of the manor seemed to groan in response. The fragment was pulling me toward it, tugging at my soul, and I could feel the weight of the house's power growing stronger with each passing second. No! I screamed, dropping the shard, but the damage had already been done. The moment it touched the ground, the manor seemed to come alive again. The air thickened, and the once crumbling walls began to shift, to rise from the debris like a corpse reawakening from the grave. The very structure of the house was rebuilding itself, the broken stone and shattered wood stitching together, twisting into place as though the manor had never been destroyed. The ceilings began to stretch higher, the dark corridors winding once more, the oppressive energy filling the air. It was happening again. The house was alive. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it pull me back into its grip. I had destroyed it once. I had broken the crystal, severed the connection, but now I realized the truth. The manor wasn't something that could be destroyed by force alone. It wasn't just a place. It was an entity, a force of pure malevolence. And as long as even the smallest part of it remained, it would continue to feed and grow. I needed to find a way to truly end it, once and for all. But as I ran through the collapsing hallways, the walls around me shifting, reforming, I felt the unmistakable presence of the house closing in. The whispers were all around me now, louder than ever. They weren't just in my mind. They were real. They were coming from the walls, from the very air itself. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered. "You are part of us now. You belong to the house." I could feel the darkness rising around me, the weight of the house's power pressing against my chest, suffocating me. The very air felt thick, like I was breathing in smoke, and the floor beneath my feet trembled with the house's fury. I ran blindly, not knowing where I was going, but I had to get out. I had to escape before it was too late. But as I reached the main door, once a grand entryway to the manor, I found it. The door was locked. I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The house was closing in on me. The darkness was too strong, the whispers too loud. And then I saw it. At the edge of my vision, standing in the doorway, was a figure, tall, shadowed, and indistinct, as though it was made of the very darkness that surrounded me. A shape that seemed familiar, but wrong. It was neither human nor ghost, just an amalgamation of shadow and sorrow. Its eyes, or what I could see of them, glowed with a malevolent red light, and the whispering grew louder, frantic. "You cannot leave," it said, its voice a low growl, echoing through the hall. "You belong to us. You will never escape." My breath caught in my throat. I had seen this figure before. In the deepest part of my mind, in the darkest corners of the manor, I had felt its presence. It was the true essence of the house, the thing that had always been in control, even when I thought I had destroyed it. The entity that had given birth to the whispers, to the madness, to the torment. The heart of the manor. It had never truly left. And then the figure stepped forward, its form flickering and distorting with the energy of the house. It reached out, and the world seemed to bend with its movements, the walls closing in on me, the shadows suffocating everything. The manor was not just a house. It was a prison. I could feel it now. It was waiting. It had always been waiting. The figure loomed in the doorway, its presence suffocating, as though the very shadows had come to life. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of voices all vying for my attention. But among them, I could make out something far more distinct. a chilling, guttural laugh, low and resonant, reverberating through the walls of the manor. It was the entity, the heart of the house, and it was finally revealing itself. "You think you can escape," the shadowed figure spoke, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "But you are bound to me, bound to the manor, forever." I backed away instinctively, my breath quickening, the weight of the house pressing against me with every step. The whispers, the oppressive atmosphere, they were all growing stronger. The very air around me seemed to hum with malevolent energy. I turned, looking for an escape, but the walls were closing in, the corridors bending and twisting, shifting as though the manor itself was coming alive, contorting to trap me in its grasp. The figure in the doorway did not move, but its eyes, if they could be called that, burned with an intensity that pierced through me, reaching deep into my soul. I could feel the hunger, the darkness, spreading out from it, infiltrating my mind, tugging at the threads of my thoughts, threatening to unravel everything. "You're nothing but a pawn," it hissed, its voice now sharp and piercing. "A part of the game I control. You never had a choice." I tried to steady myself, but my legs felt weak, as if the very force of the house was draining me of all strength. My thoughts were a blur, the whispers gnawing at my sanity, but somewhere in the depths of my mind, I remembered. I remembered what I had done. The crystal. The destruction. I had severed the bond once before. I could do it again. But now, the entity was not the only threat. The house itself, the very manor, was trying to take me, consume me. The fragment of the crystal in my hand, pulsing faintly, was still linked to it somehow, and I could feel the power, no longer just an oppressive force, but an entity, a living, breathing nightmare, suffocating me from all sides. The ground shifted beneath my feet. A deep rumble rose from the earth, and I could feel the very foundations of the manor shaking, as though it were alive. The walls groaned, the ceilings cracked, and with a deafening roar, the manor seemed to collapse in on itself, the walls closing in tighter, squeezing me into a corner. "You cannot win," the entity growled, its voice now more of a snarl. "You are trapped. You always were." I struggled to take a breath, the air thick with dust, the shadows pressing tighter against me, and I knew there was no escaping it. The manor had claimed me long ago, and now, with this fragment of crystal in my hand, I was bound to it. I could feel it, the pull, the connection. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was a living force, a consciousness that had woven itself into my very being. But there was a part of me, an ember of resistance, that refused to give in. Even in the face of such overwhelming darkness, I would not accept defeat. I had come this far. I had destroyed the heart of the manor once. I could do it again. I lifted the shard in my hand, feeling the power surge through me once more. But this time, it wasn't just the house I was fighting. It was the entity itself, the thing that had been manipulating everything from the shadows, the one that had waited for me, patiently, to become its vessel. But I was not its vessel. I was the one who would destroy it. The air around me crackled with energy as I focused all my remaining will on the shard. The whispers intensified, becoming a maddening crescendo, as if the very house was trying to drown me in its chaos. The walls seemed to press closer, suffocating me, but I held firm, my resolve hardening. The house had been feeding on me, on my fear, on my confusion, but now the tables had turned. "You will never break me," I muttered under my breath. clenching the shard tightly, and then I released it. The moment the crystal shard left my hand, the entire manor seemed to tremble, its foundations shaking violently. The energy that had been building surged outward in a burst of brilliant light, blinding, consuming everything in its path. The very walls of the house seemed to dissolve, disintegrating into nothingness, their once sturdy form now crumbling like ash. For a moment, I felt weightless, the air thick with power, and then everything exploded. The manor screamed. No, it howled, its death rattle shaking the very ground beneath me. The darkness that had consumed me for so long was now being torn apart, piece by piece, unraveling before my eyes. But as the light faded, I realized I wasn't alone. The figure, the entity, was still there. It hadn't been destroyed. It was coming for me. I stumbled backward, the floor beneath me now a chasm of blackness, endless and deep. The entity's form twisted and writhed, its shadowy limbs reaching for me, extending from the ground, from the very air. I could feel its fingers brushing against my skin, cold as death, and I realized in that moment that this was no longer just a house. This was something far older, far more dangerous. Something that could never be fully defeated. You cannot escape, the entity hissed, its voice now a chorus of tortured whispers. I am eternal. I will always be with you. The shadows closed in, swallowing me whole, and in that final moment, I felt my mind crack, the last remnants of my resistance fading into the darkness. The house, the entity, it was a part of me now, a part of my soul. The world around me was dark, endless, impenetrable. The whispers, the call of the house, surrounded me like a storm, and somewhere, deep in the vast nothingness, I heard the faintest echo of a voice. My voice. Help me. The world was dark, a void stretching endlessly around me. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down, thick and suffocating, as if the very air itself was waiting, watching. There was no ground beneath my feet, no walls surrounding me, only the oppressive, relentless pull of the void and the whispers. Oh, the whispers! They had returned, not in the corners of my mind, but all around me, echoing in the vast emptiness. I reached out into the darkness, my hand trembling, but there was nothing to touch, nothing to grasp. My heart hammered in my chest as the shadows seemed to move closer, wrapping themselves around me like a shroud. And then I heard it again, the voice. My voice. Help me. It wasn't just a whisper this time. It was a cry, distant but clear, as if someone, something, was calling out from the depths of the dark. My name, my essence, stretched out across the void, and I felt the familiar chill of fear creep up my spine. Was it my own voice? Was it the entity mimicking me? Or was there something else in this endless abyss? A shift in the air made the whispers grow louder, more frantic, as if the very fabric of this place were trembling. The walls of the manor were gone now, replaced by an endless expanse of shadows. There was no place to hide, no corner to retreat to, only the cold and the dark. I tried to move, to walk, but my body felt heavier, as though I were underwater, and each step pulled me further into the abyss. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I began to panic. My mind screamed to break free, to escape, but the darkness was all-encompassing. It was like I was drowning in it. You are mine, the voice came again, louder this time, rising from the depths of the shadows. The sound of it was all around me now, as if it were coming from every direction. I will never let you go. The walls of the void began to pulse, the shadows shifting and twisting in patterns too erratic to comprehend. I couldn't make sense of the movement. It was as though the darkness itself was alive, aware of my every thought, my every movement. A terrible sense of futility settled over me. What could I do? What could I possibly do in the face of this nightmare? But then, as if a sliver of light had pierced through the suffocating darkness, I remembered. The crystal, the fragment, the last shard. I had destroyed the heart of the manor. I had shattered the crystal once before, but the entity had returned, stronger, more persistent than before. The darkness was not just the house. It was the very essence of the entity that had inhabited it. The crystal was no longer just an object. It was the key, the anchor between the world I had known and this endless dark. I had to destroy it completely, but I was alone. There was no escape this time. No matter how hard I fought, it seemed the manor's curse would follow me forever. The shadows seemed to close in on me, suffocating me. The presence of the entity, the thing that had plagued me since my first steps in the manor, grew stronger. I could feel its hunger, its insatiable need to consume everything I was, to erase my very existence. Pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the faint pulse of the shard still buried deep within me. It was there, small but undeniable. The connection was still there. I could feel it like a chain wrapped around my soul, pulling me toward the darkness. Fight it, a voice whispered from somewhere inside me. It was faint, weak, but it was there. It was the part of me that still resisted, the part that wasn't ready to give in. I focused on that small voice, ignoring the louder ones, the ones that wanted me to surrender, to accept the inevitable. There had to be a way to sever the connection once and for all, to truly destroy the manor. But how? Suddenly, the darkness seemed to ripple, and in the distance, I saw something. A figure, a shape, moving toward me from the void. It was distant at first, but it grew closer, becoming clearer. My heart skipped a beat when I realized who, or what, it was. It was me. A twisted, shadowed version of myself, walking slowly toward me, its form writhing and shifting with the darkness that surrounded it. Its face was a hollow mask, a reflection of my own, but distorted, empty, its eyes burning with an otherworldly light. "I am you," it whispered, the words not spoken, but felt deep within my bones. "You cannot escape yourself. You cannot escape what you've become." I stepped back, fear flooding my chest. The entity had created this. It was the manifestation of my own doubts, my own guilt. It was showing me what I feared the most, that I would never truly escape the curse of the manor, that no matter how hard I fought, I was just another part of the house, another soul lost to its darkness. But then, something inside me broke through the fear. I remembered the moment when I had first stood in the manor, when I had chosen to fight. I had chosen to confront the darkness head-on, to break the cycle. And now, it seemed that the very thing I feared, the thing that sought to destroy me, was the key to my freedom. I had to face it. I had to confront the darkness within. Without thinking, I reached out to the shadowed version of myself, my hand trembling. The figure seemed to hesitate, then slowly reached back, its cold fingers brushing mine. In that moment, everything went silent. The shadows, the whispers, all the noise faded, leaving me in the stillness. It was just the two of us, standing in the void, facing one another. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper, the one that had been calling me from the beginning. It was a voice that was mine and yet not mine, echoing from the depths of the dark. "You cannot fight what you are," it said softly. I closed my eyes, focusing on the pulse of energy deep within me, the lingering shard of the crystal still buried in my soul. The crystal that had once connected me to the manor's curse. The crystal that I had shattered once, but now it was part of me. I could feel the power of the entity rising within the shadows, but this time, instead of resisting, I welcomed it. I accepted it. I am not afraid. In a burst of clarity, I reached deep within, my hand closing around the shard within me. With every ounce of will I had left, I tore it out. The pain was blinding sharp, like tearing a piece of my very soul, but I held firm. The darkness screamed. The entity roared in fury, but I didn't stop. I ripped it out, throwing it into the void. The instant the shard left my body, the dark figure in front of me dissolved, and the shadows began to scatter. The whispers faded, and the vast emptiness around me trembled as if it were coming undone. The connection, the bond that had held me prisoner for so long, was severed, and as the last echo of the darkness faded, I felt it. The void was gone. The house was gone. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was free. I opened my eyes, and the world around me shifted. The dark was no more. I could see light, faint, distant, but there. I was no longer trapped. The manor, the entity, everything that had haunted me, had been destroyed. And now I was free. The light grew stronger, spreading like a slow tide across the vast emptiness. It was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold and suffocating void I had just escaped. I stood there, suspended in a moment of stillness, breathing deeply, as if I had been holding my breath for an eternity. Every inch of my body felt heavy, yet oddly weightless. It was as though I were in between worlds, caught between the past and whatever awaited me in the future. But even in this moment of peace, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house was gone. The entity, the manor's curse, had all been destroyed, but the air still carried an unsettling chill. Something lingered, a remnant of the darkness that had once held me captive. The light that surrounded me flickered, like a candle caught in the wind, and I felt a strange unease creep up my spine. Was it possible? Could it be? Could the shadows of the manor, the very essence of it, still be lurking, waiting for a chance to return? I turned slowly, as if expecting something to emerge from the fading darkness behind me. But there was nothing. No eerie figure, no voices, no whispers. Just the quiet hum of an empty space. And yet, I still couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly free. Then it came, the sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. A whisper. I froze, my body tensing. My heart skipped a beat as the whispering grew louder, more distinct, more familiar. It was as if the air itself had begun to murmur. "You think you've escaped," the voice said. Not from any one direction, but all around me. It was a voice I had heard countless times before, low, guttural, insistent. The voice of the entity. I spun around, my eyes searching the surroundings, but still there was nothing. No shadow, no figure. The light flickered again, but this time it didn't feel comforting. It felt like a warning. "No, not this time," I muttered under my breath, trying to stay calm. I was free. I had destroyed it. I had severed the connection. But the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "You can't escape yourself," it whispered. "You can't escape what you've become. You are mine." I shook my head, desperate to fight the creeping dread that began to crawl back into my mind. I wasn't going to listen. The manor was gone. The entity was gone. The house had been destroyed. But even as I tried to convince myself, the ground beneath me began to tremble. Slowly at first, then violently, as if some ancient force was awakening. The walls, though invisible, were they not, seemed to pulse with energy. The faintest outline of the manor's architecture began to emerge in the distance, like a ghostly reflection of the place I had fought so hard to leave behind. I stumbled backward, panic rising in my chest. It couldn't be. The manor couldn't be here. Not again. The whispering continued, swirling around me, filling the air, sinking deep into my mind. "You cannot outrun your fate. You cannot escape me." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath. The shadows crept closer, crawling across the ground like a living thing. I couldn't let it take hold again. I couldn't let it drag me back. But no matter how hard I tried to push the thoughts away, I could feel it. The house, the entity, it was returning, and I was powerless to stop it. In the distance, the manor began to form fully. Its dark, towering silhouette loomed in the light like a shadow come to life. The oppressive weight of it filled the air, and with every passing second, the reality of it pressed closer, until it seemed as if the manor was closing in on me once more. And then, from the depths of the house's growing presence, I saw something, a figure. No, not a figure. It was me, the distorted version of myself, the twisted reflection that had confronted me before. It emerged from the dark doorway of the manor, walking toward me slowly, its face blank, expressionless, its eyes dark voids. The very essence of the house had taken form again. I had taken form. "You cannot escape," it whispered again, its voice coming from its lips, but somehow coming from all around me, as if the entire manor was speaking. I turned away, a surge of panic flooding through me, but the figure followed, its steps matching mine, moving in sync with my own. The connection between us was undeniable. I had thought I had destroyed it, but I hadn't. Not completely. The entity, the darkness, it was within me, still. "Please no," I whispered to myself, my hands trembling. I was trapped once again in the nightmare of my own creation. I stumbled, my mind spinning as the weight of the truth settled over me. The manor had never truly been a physical place. It was a part of me, a reflection of the darkness within. The entity had not simply been a malevolent force in the house. It was a part of my soul, the part that had been twisted by fear and despair, by guilt and regret. And now, that part of me was taking shape again. "Why did you think you could destroy me?" the reflection of myself asked, its voice a hollow mockery of my own. "I am you, and you are me." I could feel the force of its words pressing against my chest, constricting my heart. I had thought I had broken free. I had thought I had destroyed the manor, freed myself from its grip, but I was wrong. The manor was never just a house. It was a manifestation of my own darkest fears, my own weaknesses. "No," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "I won't let you control me. The whispering intensified, the figure looming over me, its form like a suffocating shadow, growing larger, consuming everything in its path. I felt the weight of it closing in on me, and for a moment I thought I might break, thought I might surrender to it once more. But I remembered the strength I had found in myself. The strength that had allowed me to break free once before. I took a deep breath, my hands clenched into fists. I was not this darkness. I was not this house. I would not be a prisoner of my own fear. With a cry, I reached out, forcing my will against the shadow. The figure faltered, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. I felt the energy surge within me, and as I pressed forward, the shadows began to dissipate, unraveling like threads of a dream. "You are not me," I said, my voice steady, unyielding. And with that, the darkness began to dissolve, the manor crumbling into nothing. The shadows faded, and the air grew clear, the oppressive weight lifting. I was free. But as the light returned, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't completely alone. Somewhere, deep within me, I could still hear the faintest whisper, an echo of the house. The light that had grown so bright around me now seemed to fade, receding like the remnants of a fading dream. But as the shadows lifted, something else remained, a faint, lingering presence that clung to the edges of my mind. It wasn't strong, not like before, but it was there, just beneath the surface. A whisper, a touch. I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the feeling. I had fought so hard to escape the manor, to free myself from the darkness that had clung to my soul. And for a moment, I had believed that I had won. But now, in the quiet aftermath, it felt as though the battle was far from over. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. The air around me was crisp, clean. The heavy weight of the darkness had lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. The whispering had stopped, but the silence was just as unnerving. I glanced around, trying to orient myself. The world felt different now, more real, but still unsettling. It was as though I were standing in the remnants of a place that once existed, something that was there and then just gone. Had I really destroyed the manor? Had I truly freed myself? Or was I still trapped in some fragment of it, a piece that lingered in the corner of my mind, always waiting for the right moment to return? I closed my eyes, trying to calm the rush of thoughts. The house, the entity, everything. It had been a reflection of my fears, my inner turmoil. It was never just about the manor. It was about me, my mind, my soul. And if I had destroyed it, why did I still feel watched? I tried to shake off the doubt, tried to tell myself that I had escaped. But deep inside, I knew something was wrong. The manor may have been gone, but the feeling it had left behind was still there. The whispers, the cold, the pull of the darkness. I could still feel it all, as if a part of me remained trapped within the very walls of the house. The entity had been a manifestation of my fears, yes, but had I truly exorcised them? Or was there still something left, waiting to be uncovered? I began walking, my footsteps echoing softly in the empty space. The ground beneath me was solid, real. There were no more shadows creeping at the edges of my vision. But still, something tugged at me. It was subtle, like the faintest rustle in the back of my mind, a memory that refused to fade. As I walked, I noticed a door in the distance, one I had not seen before. It stood alone in the middle of this strange place, dark and ominous, just like the ones in the manor. The door had no frame, no walls surrounding it. It was simply there, standing in the void. The air around it was colder, as if the door itself was a barrier between worlds. I could feel it. Whatever lay beyond that door was not meant for me. It was a threshold, a crossing between something I had left behind and something that still called to me, a shadow that lingered just outside of my reach. Without thinking, I approached it, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the cool, solid surface of the door. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just the steady pulse of my own breath. Then, a whisper broke the silence. "Do you really think you're free?" The voice was low, barely a breath. It sent a cold shiver down my spine. I recoiled instinctively, pulling my hand back, but the door did not move. It remained silent, but I could feel the presence on the other side, waiting. "Go ahead," the voice continued, taunting. "Open it. You know you want to." I stared at the door, my mind racing. The voice, so familiar, yet so different. The entity. It had returned. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn away, to forget it all. But I knew that this moment, this decision, would define everything. I had to face it. I had to confront the truth, no matter how painful. I had fought the shadows, the whispers, the darkness itself. But this was different. This was me. With a deep breath, I grasped the door handle and twisted it. The door creaked open, the sound of it echoing through the emptiness. A rush of cold air poured out from beyond, and I stepped through. The world shifted. I found myself in the manor again, but it was different. Darker, more twisted. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The floor beneath my feet was slick, covered in a thin layer of moisture, and the air smelled of decay and old dust. I was back. Somehow, I had returned. The hallway stretched out before me, familiar yet alien. The doors were all closed, as if waiting for me to open them. The manor felt alive, watching me, breathing in time with my own heartbeat. I could feel the presence of the entity, close, too close, watching, waiting. "You can never escape," the voice echoed through the halls, filling the space around me, curling around my every thought. "I will always be with you." I clenched my fists, trying to hold onto the resolve I had found before. The entity's voice, its presence, was no longer just an external force. It was part of me, a reflection of my darkest thoughts and fears. But I had faced it before. I could do it again. I had to. As I walked down the hallway, I saw the room at the end, bathed in a faint, flickering light. The same light I had seen when I first entered the manor. The same room where I had discovered the heart of the curse, the crystal. But this time, the room was different. The crystal was gone, and in its place was a mirror. I stepped closer, drawn by an invisible force, and as I gazed into it, I saw myself. Not just my reflection, but something more, something deeper. The figure in the mirror smiled, but it wasn't my smile. It was twisted, mocking, a reflection of my own insecurities, my own regrets. It was the entity, the darkness that had haunted me all along, staring back at me with cruel, unblinking eyes. "You will never be free," it whispered again. "You can't outrun what you are." I reached out to touch the mirror, my hand trembling. As my fingers brushed the surface, The reflection rippled, distorting, and the figure in the mirror began to reach back, its hand moving toward mine. And in that moment, I understood. I wasn't fighting the entity anymore. I was fighting myself. The hand from the mirror reached out, its fingers stretching toward mine, its movement unnatural, like a shadow stretching and twisting beyond the bounds of reality. I could feel its cold presence radiating through the glass, pulling at me, calling me to step forward into the unknown. The entity's smile widened, distorted in the reflection, mocking me. My breath caught in my throat as the room seemed to grow darker, the edges of my vision blurring. I wanted to pull away, to escape, but something held me in place. Something powerful, something undeniable. It was me. The reflection, the figure, it was me. You cannot escape what you are, the voice repeated, this time more insistent, more knowing. I am you. You are me. We are one. I shook my head, trying to break free from the magnetic pull, but the words resonated deep within me, echoing in my chest. The walls around me seemed to pulse with the beat of my own heart, as if they too were alive, waiting, watching. I closed my eyes, desperate to block out the reflection, to block out the voice. But it was no use. The truth was undeniable. The entity had never been a separate force, a dark power haunting the manor. It had always been a part of me, a manifestation of my own fears, my regrets, the darkness I had buried deep inside. You can't run from yourself, it whispered again, this time with a softness that sent chills through my veins. I will always be here, in your heart, in your mind. I opened my eyes, staring at the figure in the mirror. Its face was distorted now, shifting between my own and something else. Something darker, something that twisted my features into an expression of fear, of rage. My heart pounded in my chest, and I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was trapped, both within the manor and within myself. The reflection in the mirror began to change again, slowly at first, and then more rapidly. Its eyes darkened, becoming hollow, empty sockets. Its smile turned into a grimace, jagged and sharp, and its hand reached through the glass, grabbing at the air around me. I stumbled back, but the mirror pulled me toward it, as if it were no longer just a reflection but a doorway to something far worse. The cold fingers of the entity brushed my wrist, and I felt a jolt of icy terror shoot through me, paralyzing me where I stood. Don't you see? The voice whispered, now almost gentle, almost kind. You're not meant to be free. You were never meant to escape. The room around me began to twist, distorting as if reality itself were breaking apart. The walls stretched and contracted, the floor rippling like water, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight, choking me. The reflection in the mirror continued to smile, its grin widening impossibly, until it seemed to consume the entire surface. You belong to me, it breathed. I felt my body grow heavy, my limbs aching with exhaustion, but I knew I couldn't give in. Not again. I had fought too hard to let it claim me. I had broken free once before. I could do it again. Summoning every ounce of strength, I tore my gaze away from the mirror, my head spinning as the world around me warped and twisted. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of suffocation. But I couldn't stop now. I had to fight. I took a step back, then another and another, until I was running, stumbling blindly through the manor's twisted halls. The whispers followed me, echoing in the very air I breathed. They wrapped around my mind, suffocating me, pushing me to surrender. But I couldn't. I couldn't let it win. I ran past the doors that seemed to watch me, past the mirrors that reflected not just my image but my fears, my darkness. I ran, but there was nowhere to hide, no escape. The house, the manor, it was inside me. It was always inside me, and I could feel it, like a part of my own soul that had been twisted, turned into something dark and unrecognizable. The entity, the reflection in the mirror, it was a part of me, always had been. A part of me that I had tried to lock away, to bury beneath layers of lies, of denial. I was the one who had invited it in. I was the one who had allowed it to grow. The walls around me pulsed again, the air thickening. The whispers filled my ears, louder now, more frantic. "Why fight?" the voice asked, softer now, coaxing, gentle. "You don't have to be afraid. Let me in. Let me take control." I stopped running, my breath ragged, my legs trembling beneath me. It was useless. There was no escape from this place, from the house, from myself. I turned slowly, facing the heart of the manor. The mirror still hung there, in the distance, waiting for me, its surface rippling like a dark pool of water. The reflection of the entity stared back at me, its eyes hollow, its smile twisted. It was no longer just a reflection. It was a part of me. "Take it," it whispered. "Embrace it. Let it consume you." I stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath my feet, my hands shaking as I reached out for the mirror. But just as my fingers brushed the cold surface, a jolt of pain shot through my chest, and I recoiled. It wasn't the pain of the entity's touch. No, this pain was something far worse. It was the pain of realizing that this battle, this war against myself, was not something I could win by force. It was not something I could fight away with sheer willpower. The entity was not an external force. It was a reflection of my own soul, twisted by the darkness I had allowed to fester. The mirror flickered, and for the briefest moment, I saw myself as I truly was. Flawed, broken, but still standing. Still fighting. "Isn't this what you wanted?" the entity asked, its voice now tinged with amusement. "To be free." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of its words. The entity was right, in a way. I had been searching for freedom, but I had never truly understood what that meant. Freedom wasn't about escaping. It wasn't about running from the darkness. It was about facing it, accepting it, understanding it. I took a deep breath and opened my eyes. The mirror no longer seemed so terrifying. It was not my enemy. It was my reflection. And if I wanted to be free, I had to stop running. I had to face the truth about myself. I reached out again, not in fear, but with acceptance. And as my fingers brushed the mirror's surface once more, everything went dark. The darkness enveloped me completely, swallowing every trace of life, every whisper, until there was nothing but the weight of absolute silence. For a moment, I felt like I was floating in the void, suspended in time and space. My body was neither heavy nor light, but simply there. It was as if I had become one with the silence, a fragment of the emptiness that surrounded me. Then, slowly, I became aware of something. An awareness, a pulse, like a heartbeat resonating deep within the very fabric of the darkness. It was faint at first, just a subtle rhythm, but as I focused on it, the pulse grew stronger, louder, more distinct. And with it came a feeling, an emotion, that twisted and turned within me, not unlike the entity's whispers that I had heard before, but this time it was my own voice. A realization began to creep through the silence. The entity was not gone. It was never gone. It had never been something separate from me. It had been a manifestation of the very thoughts I refused to confront, the shadows I had hidden from in fear. It was me. I was it. I opened my mouth to speak, to deny it, but no sound came. The void around me remained still, unyielding. Yet I could feel its presence growing stronger, swirling around me, pulling me in like a magnetic force. The very air seemed to thrum with power, and the sense of being watched, that nagging, suffocating feeling, returned, this time even more intense. The pulse began to sync with my own heartbeat, and the darkness seemed to shift. It was no longer just a void. It was something. A presence, a place, a memory. And as the seconds stretched on, the familiar, eerie whisper returned. But this time, it wasn't the voice of the entity. It was mine. Do you remember now? The words echoed in my mind, hollow and cold. Do you remember who you are? I closed my eyes, but I couldn't escape. The images came flooding back, memories that had been buried deep beneath layers of denial. I remembered the first time I had stepped into the manor, how I had been so certain that I was there to confront something evil, something otherworldly. But now, I saw it all clearly. The house was a reflection of my own mind. The entity was the shadow of my own fear. You have always known, the voice whispered again, growing clearer, as though it were standing beside me. The darkness was never external. It was you. It is you. My breath caught in my throat. The truth was undeniable now. I had been running from myself, running from the darkness within me, afraid to acknowledge the parts of myself that I had buried. I had sought freedom from the house, from the entity, not realizing that there was nowhere to run. The manor had been a mirror to my own soul, reflecting the turmoil I had carried for so long. The pulse in the darkness began to crescendo, growing louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear, all I could feel. I could sense it now, the weight of the memories, the regrets, the guilt. They pressed in on me from every side, like walls closing in, suffocating me. And in that suffocating silence, I saw something. A doorway. It appeared slowly, like a crack in the dark fabric of the void. I couldn't say how I knew it was there. It was just there, calling me. Without thinking, I moved toward it, my body responding as if pulled by an invisible force. The pulse quickened with every step I took, matching my heartbeat, growing louder, until it consumed my thoughts entirely. My mind was no longer my own. It was as though every part of me was merging with the darkness, with the pulse, with the memory. As I stepped through the doorway, the void shifted. The world around me seemed to dissolve and reform, twisting into something new. The manor reappeared in front of me, but it was different now. It was not the same crumbling, decaying house I had seen before. No, this was pristine, untouched, as though it had never suffered the ravages of time or decay. The walls gleamed with a strange, ethereal light, and the air felt thick with an oppressive sense of expectation. I walked forward, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, and found myself in the very heart of the house, the place where I had first encountered the crystal. The room, however, was different. The crystal was gone, replaced by a single mirror, standing tall and silent, its surface reflecting not only the room around me but me. And this time, when I looked into the mirror, I saw myself, truly saw myself, not as I was, but as I am. The reflection that stared back at me was not the version of myself I had fought to escape. It was not twisted, or distorted, or broken. It was whole, complete, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. The person in the mirror was me, all of me. The darkness, the fear, the pain. It was all part of who I was. The reflection didn't mock me or smile cruelly. It simply was. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel afraid of it. Do you understand now? The voice whispered, and this time, it wasn't an external presence. It was my own voice, my own thoughts, mingling with the sound of the pulse. You cannot escape what you are. You can only accept it. I nodded slowly, a sense of peace washing over me. The truth was heavy, but it was freeing. The entity had never been something separate from me. It had been my fears, my doubts, my insecurities. Those parts of myself that I had ignored, denied, and pushed away. I had thought that by running from it, by fighting it, I could rid myself of it. But now I knew better. The darkness was not my enemy. It was a part of me that I had to embrace. I had to understand it, accept it, and integrate it into who I was. Only then could I be truly free. As the pulse began to slow, fading into the background like a distant echo, the mirror's surface shimmered, and I saw something new. Behind the reflection of myself, beyond the image I had so long resisted, was a doorway. It was small, unassuming, but there it was, an escape. I took a step toward it, feeling the weight of everything I had learned. The darkness was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't running. I was ready. With one final glance at the mirror, I stepped through the doorway. As I crossed the threshold of the doorway, the world around me seemed to dissolve once again. The manner, the reflections, the whispers, everything faded into a distant memory. But this time, it wasn't the same overwhelming silence that followed. It was different, gentler. The pulse, that heavy thrum that had once dominated my every thought, slowed to a calm rhythm, like a heartbeat at rest. I opened my eyes and found myself standing in a place that was neither here nor there, a place that felt alive. It was as if I had stepped into a space between worlds, an in-between place that existed only for this moment. The air was warm, but not oppressive. The light was soft, not harsh. There was a tranquility here that I had never known, a peace that washed over me like a tide. The weight that had once clung to my chest, the constant pressure of fear and doubt, was gone. In its place was a sense of clarity, a deep knowing. I looked around. There were no walls, no ceilings, no ground beneath my feet. The space seemed infinite, stretching out in all directions, filled with a soft, golden glow. The boundaries of the world I had known no longer existed here. I felt untethered, free, like I could float away if I wished, weightless in this strange and peaceful place. And then I felt it, a presence, not a force, not an entity, but something else, something familiar. I turned slowly, my heart beating a little faster, but not out of fear. I didn't fear this presence. I felt drawn to it like a magnet, as though it had been waiting for me all along. In the distance, a figure appeared. At first, it was just a shadow, a silhouette against the glowing backdrop, but as it drew closer, the figure became clearer, sharper, more defined. It was a person, though their face was obscured, bathed in a soft light that made it impossible to see their features. But it didn't matter. I knew who they were. The figure reached out a hand, and though I couldn't see their face, I felt an undeniable warmth in their gesture. It was an invitation, not an intrusion. Without thinking, I stepped forward, drawn to them as though we were two parts of the same whole, reunited after an eternity of separation. As I came closer, the figure's outline became clearer, the features of their face becoming visible under the soft glow. It was me, but it wasn't. It was a version of me that had been lost, forgotten, somewhere along the way. A version of me that had never been clouded by fear, by guilt, by the shadows that had haunted me. This was the part of me that had always been there, buried beneath the darkness I had fought to escape. I reached out to take the hand of this reflection of myself, and as my fingers touched theirs, the world around me seemed to shift. The peaceful glow intensified, and I felt the pulse, strong and steady, but no longer suffocating, pounding in my chest, in my veins. It was no longer a pulse of fear, of darkness. It was a pulse of understanding, of acceptance. The dark corners of my soul, the shadows that had once whispered my worst nightmares, began to fade away. "I've been waiting for you," the figure said, and their voice was mine, but gentler, softer. It was a voice that spoke not from fear, but from a deep, unshakable peace. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their words settle in my chest. "I didn't understand," I whispered, my voice breaking the silence. "I thought I had to fight it. I thought I had to escape." The figure nodded, their eyes soft with understanding. "You never needed to fight it. You needed to accept it. All of it. The darkness, the fear, the regret. They were never your enemies. They were parts of you that you tried to push away. But now you've learned to embrace them, to let them be." I closed my eyes, feeling the truth of those words sink in. The journey I had been on, the battles I had fought, it wasn't about defeating something external. It wasn't about running away from the darkness. It was about understanding it, accepting it as part of who I was. The entity, the house, the manor. It had never been an external force. It had been me. And now, for the first time, I could see myself in a way I never had before. I opened my eyes and looked at the figure again. It was me, but not the broken, twisted version that had wandered through the manor. This was me in my truest form, the version of myself I had kept hidden for so long, whole, at peace. "We are one," the figure said. "We always have been." I felt the truth of those words echo in my heart, and I smiled, genuinely, for the first time in what felt like forever. I had spent so long running from myself, fighting against the darkness that had always been a part of me. But now, I saw it for what it truly was, a shadow that only existed because I had feared it. It was part of me, yes, but it was no longer something I had to hide from or defeat. It was something I could live with, something I could integrate into who I was. The figure reached out, and I took their hand once again. Together, we stood in the glowing space, the pulse between us steady and calm. The darkness no longer loomed over us. It was simply gone. There was no need for fear, no need for escape. There was only acceptance. And then, the world began to change once more. The light around us began to shift, fading gently into the background. The space that had been so infinite and undefined now began to solidify, taking shape. A familiar place appeared before me, a room, with walls lined with bookshelves, a comfortable chair by the window. It was a place I had known once, long ago, a place that felt like home. The figure beside me smiled, and I knew without asking that they were not going to remain here with me. This moment, this place, had been a passage, a bridge from the darkness to the light. And now it was time for me to move on. "You're free," the figure said, their voice soft but filled with meaning. "You've found your peace. You've found your balance." I nodded, my chest full of warmth and understanding. It was time to leave the shadows behind. I had faced them, accepted them, and now I could walk forward with clarity, with peace. The figure began to fade, their form dissolving into the light. But as they did, I felt no sadness, no fear, only gratitude. And then, as the last remnants of their presence faded into the light, I was left standing alone in the room. I took a deep breath, letting the calm wash over me. The whispering was gone. The pulse had quieted. The manner was no more. All that remained was me. And for the first time in my life, I was truly at peace. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. Hollow Grove, a small, seemingly forgotten village tucked away in the remote countryside, had always been a place that locals avoided speaking of. The roads leading into the village were overgrown with brambles. The houses stood empty with broken windows staring out like vacant eyes, and the only sounds to be heard were the creaks of ancient trees swaying in the wind and the occasional distant howl of a wild animal. Elliot had heard the stories. Everyone in the nearby town had. Whispers of strange happenings, disappearances, and the eerie silence that blanketed Hollow Grove after dark. But Elliot was different. He wasn't afraid of stories. He wasn't afraid of what others feared. He was, after all, a journalist, always in search of the truth, no matter how uncomfortable or disturbing it might be. And so, when he received a mysterious letter in the mail, sealed with an old, cracked wax emblem, his curiosity got the better of him. The letter, with no return address, simply read, "Come to Hollow Grove. Find out what they won't tell you. The truth is waiting." It was odd, no doubt, and the lack of a name or any explanation intrigued him even more. The letter was typed, no handwriting, so impersonal, so deliberate. And the mention of the truth, that was the final push. Elliot, ever the skeptic, couldn't resist. He had to go. As he drove through the winding roads, the sky began to darken, clouds gathering overhead, blocking out the sun. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches twisting and bending unnaturally, as if watching him. The further he drove, the quieter it became, until the only sound was the steady hum of his car's engine. Finally, he reached Hollow Grove. It was as he had expected, silent. The village looked abandoned, like it had been forgotten by time itself. The houses were in various states of disrepair, with peeling paint, broken fences, and weeds growing in the cracks of the cobbled streets. Not a soul was in sight. Elliot parked his car by what looked like the old town hall, a grand, imposing building with a large clock tower. But the clock was stopped at midnight. Stepping out of his car, Elliot felt a chill crawl down his spine, though he tried to dismiss it as the result of the biting wind. He checked his watch. It was late afternoon, but the sun was already sinking, casting an ominous glow over the village. It was the kind of quiet that felt wrong, as if something, some presence, was watching him, waiting. He walked toward the town hall, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The windows of the building were dark, but the door was slightly ajar. Cautiously, he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the smell of mildew heavy in the atmosphere. The walls were lined with old portraits, their faces obscured by grime. A long, winding staircase led up to the second floor, but it was the room at the back of the hall that caught Elliot's attention. It was different from the rest of the building. While everything else was covered in dust and decay, this room had an unnatural, almost unnatural glow to it, as if something inside was alive. He stepped closer, heart pounding in his chest. As he pushed the door open, a cold gust of air swept past him. The room was empty, save for a single object in the center, a large, antique mirror. The mirror was framed in gold, but the glass was cracked, spider-webbed with age. Its surface, however, was strangely clear, as though it had been recently cleaned. For a moment, Elliot thought he saw something moving in the reflection, a shadow flickering at the edge of the glass. His breath caught. The shadow was gone in an instant. He leaned in closer, peering into the reflection. His own face stared back at him, but then something strange happened. The image in the mirror shifted, blurring for a moment, before another figure appeared behind him, a tall figure, cloaked in darkness. Elliot spun around, but the room was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, and he found himself staring at his own reflection once more. He stepped back, suddenly unsure. The silence in the room deepened. But before he could turn to leave, the mirror seemed to whisper, just barely audible, a soft voice carried on the wind. "Help us." The words sent a jolt of fear through his body. He quickly turned and bolted out of the room, the door slamming shut behind him with an almost finality to it. His heart was pounding in his chest, his hands trembling. What had he just seen? What had that whisper been? The wind outside had picked up, and the sky had darkened even further, now nearly pitch black. There was no sign of life anywhere. He looked around, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping up his spine. It was then that he noticed something strange. The streets, which had been empty before, now seemed to be filled with a fog, thin at first, but growing thicker by the second, as if it were alive, crawling through the streets, enveloping the houses. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure standing at the far end of the street. It was a woman, dressed in a long, flowing white gown. Her back was turned to him, but even from a distance, Elliot could see her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if she were looking up at something that wasn't there. A shiver ran down his spine. He knew he should leave, but something held him there, a pull he couldn't explain. Slowly, he began to walk toward her, the fog swirling around his feet, thickening with every step. The closer he got, the clearer she became. Her pale skin, her long dark hair hanging like a veil, and then her face, when she finally turned toward him. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to pull the light out of the air. Her mouth was stretched into an eerie grin, but it wasn't the smile of a person. It was something far older, something far more sinister. And then she spoke. "Welcome to Hollow Grove," she whispered, her voice a low rasp, like something long dead. "You should never have come." The fog thickened around Elliot, swallowing him whole, as if the world itself were closing in. His breath quickened, the cold seeping into his bones. His heart raced in his chest, thumping wildly as he stared at the woman. Her hollow eyes locked onto his, pulling him in, drawing him deeper into the darkness. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The world around him grew still, the sounds of the wind and distant howls vanishing into an unnatural silence. He couldn't move. His legs felt like they had turned to stone, frozen in place by the weight of her gaze. The woman stood motionless, her grin stretching unnervingly wide, her eyes, empty, black voids, seeming to pierce through him. "You should never have come," she repeated, her voice rasping through the air like the scrape of nails on a chalkboard. Elliot took a step back, his breath coming out in shallow gasps. He tried to turn and run, but his body wouldn't obey him. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her, couldn't escape the weight of her presence. Then, without warning, the woman tilted her head at an impossible angle, a grotesque motion that made his stomach churn. Her neck cracked loudly, the sound echoing in the eerie silence. A laugh, low and hollow, escaped her lips, a laugh that made his skin crawl. "You've been warned," she hissed, her voice growing colder, more distant. "We've all been waiting." With that, the fog surged forward, engulfing him. He staggered backward, his heart pounding in his throat, but the fog was everywhere, around him, through him, suffocating him. He gasped for air, feeling the cold moisture settle deep into his lungs, his eyes stinging as the mist blurred his vision. The world around him seemed to twist and warp, as if he were caught between two realities. The village, the town hall, the woman. Everything felt like a dream or a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. Suddenly, a voice broke through the haze. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. "Leave now, or never leave." Elliot froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The voice, soft, distant, sounded familiar. He turned his head, his pulse pounding in his ears. It was the voice from the mirror. His mind raced, panic rising. The figure in the reflection, the one he'd seen standing behind him in the shattered mirror, had spoken those words. "Help us." He had to leave. Whatever this place was, whatever curse lay over Hollow Grove, he knew now that he wasn't meant to be here. He needed to get out, fast. But as he turned to run, the fog parted, revealing a figure standing before him. This time, it wasn't the woman in the gown. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by the shadows of his hood. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped at his sides, his head slightly tilted as if studying Elliot. Elliot stopped in his tracks, unable to move forward. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The man didn't speak, but his presence was undeniable. He was blocking Elliot's way, his body casting an oppressive shadow over the fog-covered street. "Who are you?" Elliot demanded, his voice shaking despite his attempt to sound confident. "What's going on here?" The figure remained silent, but Elliot could feel a strange pull, a magnetic force drawing him in. Slowly, almost as if against his will, he began to take a step forward. "Don't," the voice whispered again, louder this time. "You must leave before it's too late." But the man didn't move. He simply stood there, waiting. Elliot's feet felt like they were stuck in place, as though the very ground had become treacherous, pulling at him, urging him to stay. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet shifted. The fog parted in the distance, revealing the village square, bathed in an eerie, pale light. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long, warped shadows that twisted and writhed along the cracked cobblestones. There, standing in the middle of the square, was an old stone fountain, its water still, reflecting the pale light of the street lamps. But what caught Elliot's attention wasn't the fountain itself. It was the shape of something floating in the water. A body. A man, face down, his body floating in the stagnant water. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his clothes were tattered and torn. The man's eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the sky as if caught in eternal torment. His lips were blue, frozen in death. Elliot's heart dropped. He had seen this man before, or at least someone who looked like him. The man in the mirror, the one with the eyes. The figure in front of him finally spoke. The voice was low, distorted, as though it were coming from the very fog around them. "Do you see him?" the figure asked. "He never left. None of us do." Elliot felt his blood run cold. "What happened to him?" he whispered. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step forward, his dark eyes glinting in the dim light. "That is what happens when you fail to heed the warning," he said, his voice hollow and distant. "We all end up like him, trapped, forgotten, lost to the darkness." Elliot shook his head, trying to push through the fog in his mind. "No, this can't be real. I'm just dreaming. This is just a nightmare." "Then wake up," the figure said simply, his voice carrying an edge of finality. "But you won't. Not now. Not ever." The figure reached out, his hand grazing Elliot's shoulder. As his fingers touched his skin, a sharp, icy cold shot through Elliot's body. He gasped, feeling a wave of dread crash over him like a cold tide. The sensation of cold seeped into his very bones, and for a moment, everything around him blurred and wavered. The fog grew thicker, the world bending around him in grotesque shapes. With a sudden jolt, Elliot's mind snapped back to the present. The fog parted once again, but this time there was no figure. The village square was empty, save for the eerie glow of the lamps. The fountain, the body, the man, they were gone. He was alone. But something had changed. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was heavy, suffocating, like something was waiting for him to move, to speak, to break it. "Leave now." The voice echoed once more, not from a distance but inside his own mind. And this time, Elliot listened. Without another glance back, he turned and ran. But he wasn't running from the village. He was running from himself. Elliot's feet pounded against the cold cobblestones as he sprinted through the fog-choked streets, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The chilling cold of the mist clung to his skin, seeping into his clothes, but it wasn't the cold that made his skin crawl. It was the feeling that someone was watching him. The silence was deafening, pressing in from all sides, as if Hollow Grove itself were holding its breath, waiting for him to slip up, to falter. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, his legs starting to feel like lead, as though the village was trying to pull him back, to drag him down into its depths. He had to leave. He had to get out before it was too late. His car was parked just ahead, and for a fleeting moment, hope stirred in his chest. If he could just reach it, if he could just drive away. But no, he knew, deep down, that it wasn't going to be that easy. Hollow Grove had already claimed him. He was already a part of it, whether he liked it or not. Just as he reached his car, something changed in the air. The temperature dropped even further, and the fog swirled unnaturally around him, swirling with a malevolent energy. He stopped, his hand hovering over the car door, his pulse quickening. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was standing right behind him. Without turning around, he spoke in a voice that trembled with fear. "What do you want from me?" There was no answer at first, just the sound of his own ragged breathing, and then, faintly, so faint that he thought he had imagined it, a whisper, a soft, echoing voice that seemed to come from the fog itself. "You cannot leave." Elliot's heart raced in his chest. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice he had heard in the mirror, the voice that had whispered, "Help us." But now it sounded different. It was darker, more insistent, and it seemed to seep into his very soul. "We're all here, Elliot. All of us." The fog thickened, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. The air grew dense with a smell of decay, as if something long forgotten had been stirred from its grave. Elliot spun around, his heart in his throat, but the street behind him was empty. Nothing but the dense fog. But that was the problem, wasn't it? The emptiness. The feeling that something was out there, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. "You're one of us now," the voice murmured, closer this time, as though it were right beside him. "We'll never let you leave. Not until you understand. Not until you join us." He looked around frantically, searching for any sign of movement. But everything was still, and yet everything felt wrong. The village that had once seemed abandoned now felt alive with an unseen presence, its dark corners filled with the weight of things unsaid. "Join you," Elliot hissed, his breath coming out in angry, panicked bursts. "I don't want anything to do with this. Let me go." The fog seemed to respond to his words, swirling in a tight circle around him, a whirling vortex that began to pull him in. He stumbled backward, clutching the door handle of his car, trying desperately to fight the pull. The fog was no longer just mist. It felt solid, like it had substance, like it was alive, hungry for him. "The truth is waiting," the voice echoed once more. "It's always been waiting." Elliot's mind raced. He had to leave. He had to break free of the grip this place had on him. But there was no escaping it. Was there? No running. Hollow Grove wasn't just a village. It was a prison, a curse that wrapped itself around the souls of anyone who dared to enter. And now, Elliot realized with cold dread, he was no different from the others. The ones who had come here before, the ones who had disappeared, trapped in this place forever. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and the fog thickened even further, swirling into shapes, twisting into shadows that moved of their own accord. For a moment, he thought he saw faces, faces of the lost, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. They seemed to watch him from the mist, reaching out with unseen hands, begging for help. But there was no help. "Let me out of here," Elliot screamed, his voice cracking as he wrenched open the car door, throwing himself inside. He slammed the door shut, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. The car sputtered to life with a groan, but as he put it in reverse, the fog closed in around him. He couldn't see the road. He couldn't see anything except the thick, oppressive gray that surrounded him on all sides. The air was suffocating, the space inside the car closing in on him as if the fog itself was crawling through the cracks. Suddenly, the car jerked to a halt. Elliot's heart stopped. The fog had parted briefly, but the road ahead was gone. In its place stood the same old town hall, looming dark and silent in the distance. The large clock tower, still stopped at midnight, stared down at him with lifeless eyes. But there was no mistaking it. The road had been there before. He had seen it. He had driven down it, and now it was gone, as if the very fabric of Hollow Grove had twisted and reshaped itself, swallowing the path he had taken. Elliot's blood ran cold. His hand trembled on the steering wheel as he looked around. The village had shifted. It had changed. The fog had grown thicker, more oppressive, and the distant echoes of whispers filled the air. Voices that seemed to come from the very walls of the town hall, from the earth beneath his feet. The town was alive, and it wasn't going to let him leave. As he stared at the dark windows of the town hall, something moved inside. A shadow passed by, tall and looming, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty streets. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. It was coming for him. In a blind panic, he threw the car into drive and slammed the gas pedal, desperate to break free from the tightening grip of Hollow Grove. But the fog only thickened, swirling in his path, dragging him back. The road ahead was no longer a road. It was a maze, a winding labyrinth of trees and streets that seemed to fold in on themselves. And in the distance, the faint echo of a voice. That voice rang through the mist. "Welcome to Hollow Grove," it whispered. "You will never leave." His breath was ragged, his hands slick with sweat as he gripped the wheel. What was that? The thought screamed through his mind. What was after him? For a moment, everything was still. The car stood motionless in the center of the fog-choked street. The village around him remained eerily silent. No sound except the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. Then the voice came again. "You cannot escape. You are one of us now." Elliot's pulse raced as he twisted the key in the ignition, trying to start the car again. But the engine sputtered, refusing to turn over. Panic surged in his chest. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of where the figure had gone. But all he could see was fog and shadows, the village stretching on endlessly, like it had been frozen in time. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of his own heartbeat. "Let me leave." The words hung in the air, a prayer to something that couldn't hear him, or perhaps refused to. As if in response, a low rumble echoed from the town hall in the distance, the sound of something ancient and otherworldly stirring beneath the earth. Elliot's eyes widened. His breath caught in his throat as the ground beneath the car seemed to tremble. Without warning, the car door flew open, as if something had yanked it from the inside. Elliot was thrown backward, landing hard against the seat, his body jolting with the impact. Before he could even process what had happened, the fog seemed to swallow him whole. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as he slammed the accelerator to the floor, desperately trying to break free from the clutches of Hollow Grove. The car lurched forward, its tires spinning over the cobbled streets, but the fog seemed to swallow every inch of progress. It was as if the road itself was refusing to let him escape, the dense mist swirling in chaotic patterns, thick and suffocating. He gripped the wheel with white-knuckled hands, the engine roaring in protest, but the road ahead was nothing but a blur of shadows and shapes. The darkness seemed to close in on him, pressing down from every direction. The village, the cursed village, was alive, and it was determined to keep him within its borders. He glanced in the rear-view mirror. Nothing. The fog seemed to stretch endlessly behind him, swallowing the path he had just taken. No road. No exit. The trees on either side of the street were closing in, their twisted limbs reaching out like gnarled hands, clawing at the car. Suddenly, the car lurched again. A sharp, jarring motion that nearly sent Elliot's head into the steering wheel. He swerved, but the tires skidded on the slick road, and the car fishtailed. Panic surged through him. The road ahead was nothing but a black void now, a vast emptiness, and the only thing he could hear was the beating of his own heart, loud and deafening in the quiet, oppressive air. His hands trembled as he tried to steady the wheel, but something strange was happening. The headlights, the only source of light in the suffocating darkness, suddenly flickered, and when they came back on, Elliot saw it. A figure, a shadow moving through the fog. It wasn't just a silhouette. It was a person. No, not a person. Something else. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, its form elongated and distorted, as if it were being pulled out of shape by some unseen force. The face was shrouded in the thick mist, but the shape of its eyes glinted faintly, reflecting the headlights in a way that made Elliot's blood run cold. Without warning, the figure lunged toward the car. The headlights flickered again, and for a split second, the figure was gone. But Elliot didn't need to see it again. He could feel it, like a dark presence closing in around him. He slammed his foot down on the brake, his heart in his throat as the car came to a screeching halt. It rushed into the car, filling the interior, choking him, suffocating him. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, but it was thick, like smoke, like drowning. The world outside the car blurred into indistinct shapes and shadows. He couldn't see anything. His vision was clouded, his thoughts clouded. Everything was becoming fog. Then he heard it again. The voice, louder this time, as if it were inside his very mind. "You're already too late. There's no going back." Elliot's heart thundered in his chest. He forced himself to sit up, his body shaking, his head pounding. Through the haze of fog, he finally saw it. A figure standing just outside the car, illuminated by the dim glow of the headlights. It was the woman. Her long, flowing white gown shimmered faintly in the dark, her hair hanging like a veil around her face. She tilted her head at an impossible angle, her hollow eyes fixed on him. Her lips stretched into a grin that wasn't a grin at all, but a twisted, unnatural mockery of one. Her mouth opened, and the words spilled out like a whisper from a nightmare. "I told you," she said, her voice ringing with an eerie calmness. "You should never have come." Before Elliot could react, the fog thickened even more, wrapping around the car like tendrils of darkness. The world outside seemed to disintegrate, the fog closing in so tightly that he could barely see the front of the car. He glanced at the rearview mirror, but what he saw reflected back at him wasn't his own face. It was the man from the fountain. His eyes were wide open, staring at Elliot with a hollow gaze, his body limp and lifeless. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His face twisted in silent agony, his mouth moving as if trying to scream, but the words were drowned out by the rising fog. The car's mirrors filled with a parade of other faces, pale, distorted, lost in some kind of endless suffering. The souls of Hollow Grove. Panic surged through Elliot as the fog seemed to press against him, suffocating him, pulling him toward the door. His breath was tight in his chest, his hands fumbling to start the car again, but it wouldn't start. He couldn't get out. The village had him now. "Welcome to Hollow Grove," the woman whispered, her voice cold, almost triumphant. Elliot opened his mouth to scream, but the sound never came. The car door slammed shut, the world went black, and the last thing Elliot heard was the faint, distant sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and growing louder. Elliot's pulse raced as the fog closed in around him, the air thick with an oppressive, suffocating weight. His vision blurred, and his breath came in desperate, shallow gasps. He couldn't move. He couldn't escape. Hollow Grove had consumed him, and now he was trapped within it, like so many before him. Outside the car, the figure of the woman stood still, her unnerving smile stretching wider, as if savoring every moment of his terror. Her hollow eyes pierced through the fog, locking onto his with an intensity that felt like it was reaching into his very soul. "You can't leave," she whispered again, her voice a mere thread in the thickening fog. It was almost comforting in its cold certainty, but beneath it, there was a growing sense of dread, an unbearable knowledge that there was no way out. "You belong here now. We all do." Elliot's mind reeled, his body frozen in place. The man from the fountain, his lifeless face had vanished from the mirrors, but his presence lingered. The voices of the lost souls, those who had once been like him, full of life and hope, filled his ears. They were all around him, their whispers melding into one endless chorus. "Please," Elliot whispered hoarsely, the words escaping his lips before he could even think. "Please, let me go. I didn't mean to. It's too late." The woman's voice cut through his plea, her tone colder than the fog itself. She took a step closer, her feet gliding soundlessly over the cobblestones. As she moved, the air seemed to grow heavier, the weight of the village's curse pressing harder on him. No escape, no hope. The realization hit him like a fist to the gut. There was no way out. Hollow Grove was more than just a village. It was a trap, a living, breathing entity that fed on the lost, the broken, the desperate. And now, Elliot was one of them. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with the effort, as if he could force the car to move, force himself to break free. But the engine sputtered and died again, the fog creeping closer, the shadows of the lost crowding in on him. The woman was right. There was no going back. "Do you understand now?" The woman's voice echoed through the car, seeping into his bones, pulling him deeper into the darkness of Hollow Grove. "We're all waiting for you, all of us, the ones who came before, and the ones who will come after." Elliot's breath hitched in his throat. He didn't want to understand. He didn't want to accept this fate. He didn't want to be one of them, the souls doomed to wander these cursed streets for eternity, their voices trapped in the fog, their bodies lost to time. "It's not just the living who are trapped here," the woman continued, her voice almost tender now, as if she were trying to comfort him. "The dead are waiting for the living, and the living, well, the living are waiting to join us." Tears burned in Elliot's eyes. His mind raced for a solution, for anything to get him out of this nightmare, but there was nothing. There were no answers, no escape, just the fog, the shadows, and the cold grip of Hollow Grove. He couldn't fight it anymore. There was no running, no screaming, no pleading that would change his fate. As the fog grew thicker, the world around him seemed to crumble. The car, his last remaining connection to the outside world, felt smaller, suffocated, as if it were being swallowed by the village itself. "Let it happen," the woman whispered, her voice soft and coaxing. "You'll be free once you stop fighting. We all are." Elliot's eyes closed, the weight of exhaustion and despair settling in his bones. He let go. For the first time since arriving in Hollow Grove, he let himself surrender to the dark, to the curse that had claimed him. The fog closed in, the voices of the lost growing louder, a cacophony of anguish and longing. And then, as the fog swallowed him whole, as the last remnants of his consciousness faded, Elliot understood. He understood what Hollow Grove truly was. It wasn't just a village. It was a prison. A prison for souls. A place where time no longer mattered. A place where the lost, the broken, the desperate came to stay. Forever. His body felt weightless as the fog pulled him deeper, his mind drifting into the endless darkness. The woman's smile lingered in his fading vision, her eyes glowing faintly, beckoning him forward. Elliot was no longer just a visitor. He was one of them now. He was home. The fog closed around him entirely, and Hollow Grove was silent once more. And in the distance, the bell of the old town hall rang 12 times, its echo lingering in the air. Her heart skipped a beat. But as the figure drew closer, she saw that it wasn't him. It was something else, something dark. The forest wasn't done with her yet. Rachel turned, her breath quickening as the shadows of the woods closed in around her once more. If you enjoyed the story, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on.